Hello everyone. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. The Earl family had originally moved from Iowa to Louisiana around the 1890s to pursue rice farming, but they quickly became unpopular with some locals, sparking rumors that they had left Iowa to escape the wrath of someone they had wronged. After facing repeated crop failures, they relocated to Welsh, where L.S. Earl opened a small store, though by the turn of the century, they had returned to rice farming once again. At the beginning of 1902, the family consisted of L.S. Earl and his wife, along with their children, Ward, Fred, John, Lemuel, Maud, and Fay. L.S. Earl, his wife, and the younger children lived on a main family farm located a few miles southeast of Welsh. While Ward lived in a separate nearby house, Fred remained in Iowa, and Maud stayed with a family she worked for in Welsh. Many people at the time whispered that Ward's house was haunted, a belief fueled both by its eerie appearance and by the fact that at least 2 deaths had occurred in or as a result of events in the house. In 1901, Albert Edwin Ed Batson, born in Spickard, Missouri to a divorced mother and previously employed as a railroad hand, arrived in Welsh and was offered work on the Earl family's rice farm by Ward, moving into the homesteader's cottage alongside him. The small community would later be shocked when Ward Earl was last seen alive on the night of February 11, 1902, a disappearance that would leave lingering unease about the mysterious events surrounding the family and their farm. All of the victims were brutally killed, either shot or bludgeoned, and in addition, their throats had been cut, with cloth wrapped around the wounds in a grim attempt to muffle the injuries. By the time the bodies were discovered, they had already undergone significant decomposition, indicating that they had been dead for several days. Every member of the family had been murdered except for Fred and Maud Earl, who were away and thus spared from the carnage. Following the killings, a man claiming to be Ward Earl appeared in the downtown area of Lake Charles, attempting to sell the family's livestock before visiting a gun store and then a watch repair shop, where he left behind Earl's shotgun and watch. Suspiciously, he gave false names, identifying himself as C.R. Batson and A. Batson, likely aware that the shopkeepers could recognize the real Ward Earl. Witnesses later identified the man as Albert Batson, noting a distinctive long scar on the left side of his face. He then managed to secure a driver for Wells Fargo and sent a package to his mother in Missouri, which was later found to contain nothing but rice, before reclaiming the watch, though he abandoned both the livestock and the shotgun, leaving behind a trail of unsettling actions that deepened the mystery surrounding the horrific murders. Suspicion grew among Ward Earl's acquaintances after the attempted sale of his animals, prompting Paul Daniels, a local businessman, to contact Maud Earl, who had not heard from her family for several days. Alarmed, Maud returned to the family home with a driver, where they made the grim discovery of the bodies, revealing the full scale of the tragedy. A search of the family's buggy uncovered a vest containing a letter signed by Albert Batson, ending with the chilling words, "Haha, bye-bye, I'm gone," which authorities would later refer to as the infamous "Haha letter." By the time this evidence came to light, Batson had already fled Louisiana, boarding a train to Missouri. On that same day, he was apprehended by Deputy Isaac Fontenot in Princeton, Missouri, and subsequently returned to Louisiana to face charges for the murders. At the time of his arrest, he carried only a few dollars in cash, adding a final eerie detail to the shocking chain of events that had begun months earlier with the Earl family's struggles and mysterious deaths. The trial of Albert Batson was presided over by Judge E.D. Miller, and throughout the proceedings, Batson did not testify in his own defense, consistently maintaining his innocence. Observers noted that he was unusually well-behaved and polite for a prisoner facing such serious charges, leading some to speculate about his possible innocence. The murders and the high-profile trial became a cause célèbre in Louisiana during 1902 and 1903, capturing widespread public attention. Batson was represented by 2 court-appointed attorneys, Paul Somperak and Winston Overton, who argued that he had no discernible motive to kill any member of the Earl family, let alone the entire household. They emphasized the lack of concrete evidence tying him to the crime, instead suggesting that two unidentified strangers who had been seen in the area, one of whom bore a similar scar to Batson, might have been responsible. According to the defense, these men had a grudge against the Earl family and had tracked them down to commit the murders, framing Batson in the process and creating doubt about his guilt. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Joseph Moore, argued that Albert Batson had brutally murdered the Earl family, stolen their livestock, and then fled to Missouri, presenting the infamous "Ha-Ha letter" as evidence that Batson had exhibited suicidal tendencies, though they offered no explanation for why he did not act on such impulses. The authorities maintained that the letter reflected both his recklessness and callousness, portraying a man capable of extreme violence and indifference to human life, and used this argument to establish his direct responsibility for the murders, the theft, and the flight from justice, framing the case as a clear-cut example of premeditated brutality in the eyes of the public and the courts in Louisiana during 1902 and 1903. In 1903, Associated Press reporter Charles Dobson published a book titled Guilty? Sidelights on the Batson Case, a recrudescence of the murder of the Earl family in Louisiana, in which he argued that Albert Batson was not the true killer and instead claimed that two unidentified men, referred to as Number 1 and Number 2, were responsible for the murders. Dobson suggested that the killings may have been rooted in an earlier feud the Earl family had developed while living in Kansas, a theory that would later be echoed decades afterward in a 1997 article published by the Daily Advertiser in Lafayette. Despite these alternative theories, Batson was found guilty in April 1902 and sentenced to death, though the Louisiana Supreme Court later overturned the verdict due to a legal technicality, ordering a new trial. In March 1903, Batson was again found guilty and sentenced to death, but this sentence was suspended when the defense once more requested a new trial. When those motions were denied, Batson was sentenced to death for a third time, only for that sentence to be immediately suspended because he had not been formally asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. After being given the opportunity, Batson once again declared his innocence and was sentenced for a fourth and final time to death, bringing the long and controversial legal battle to a grim conclusion. Following Albert Batson's sentencing, members of Louisiana's State Pardon Board took an interest in the case and urged Governor William Wright Hurd to commute the death sentence, prompting the governor to request that Judge E.D. Miller, who had presided over both trials, travel to Baton Rouge to discuss the matter, a request Miller firmly refused. With no intervention granted, Batson was executed by hanging at the Lake Charles Jail on August 15, 1903, bringing a definitive and somber end to one of Louisiana's most controversial criminal cases. Despite fading from public memory over time, the case left a cultural imprint, inspiring blues musician Wilson Jones, also known as Stab and Chain, to compose a lengthy murder ballad titled Batson, which ran for 12 minutes and recounted the events leading up to the crime and Batson's capture, deliberately omitting the murders themselves. The song subtly referenced earlier murder ballads, such as Frankie and Albert and Lambkin, works in which the killers were guilty but provoked, and a transcription of the ballad was later published in John and Alan Lomax's book Our Singing Country in 1941. Some commentators interpreted the song as portraying Batson as an unlucky and possibly innocent man wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit, a portrayal that contrasted sharply with most contemporary accounts, while the Lomaxes themselves believed the ballad implied Batson's guilt, noting that the singer's sympathies lay entirely with the accused rather than the victims. The song would later be covered by several other performers, briefly reviving interest in the case before it once again slipped into obscurity, until renewed attention emerged in 2014 with the publication of Until You Are Dead, 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 The Hanging of Albert Edwin Batson, a book that closely examined the evidence and argued for the certainty of Batson's guilt, receiving generally positive reviews and reopening debate over a tragedy that had haunted Louisiana since the early years of the 20th century. Case 2, Let Me Explain in 1911, Charles Lawson married Fanny Mannering, and together they built a growing family that would eventually include 8 children, though tragedy struck early when their third child, William, born in 1914, died from illness in 1920. In 1918, after Lawson's younger brothers Marion and Elijah moved to the Germantown area, Charles followed with his own family, where they worked hard as tenant tobacco farmers, slowly saving enough money to change their fortunes. By 1927, their persistence paid off when they were able to purchase their own farm on Brook Cove Road, marking a rare moment of stability and success. In 1929, just days before Christmas, Charles Lawson took his wife Fanny and their 7 surviving children, Arthur, Marie, Carrie, Mabel, James, Raymond, and infant Mary Lou, in a town to buy new clothes and have a family portrait taken, an act considered highly unusual for a rural working-class family of that era. This sudden display of prosperity and domestic pride later fueled speculation that Lawson's actions were deliberate and premeditated, though others argued that his ownership of the farm for 2 years and an Associated Press report published the day after the murders, describing him as a well-to-do farmer, made such pre-Christmas preparations seem entirely reasonable at the time, masking the darkness that would soon follow. After his death, speculation emerged that Charles Lawson may have impregnated his daughter Marie, a disturbing theory that added a darker layer to the tragedy. On the afternoon of December 25th, 1929, Lawson carried out the first part of the massacre by targeting his daughters Carrie and Mabel as they set out to visit their uncle and aunt. He waited for them near the tobacco barn, positioning himself until they were close enough, then shot them with a shotgun before ensuring they were dead by striking them repeatedly. After killing them, Lawson placed their bodies inside the tobacco barn, transforming a place of routine farm labor into the first silent crime scene of the day. After killing his daughters, Charles Lawson returned to the house and shot his wife Fanny as she stood on the porch, and the sound of the gun immediately triggered screams from inside, where Marie cried out while the 2 young boys, James and Raymond, desperately tried to hide. Lawson then shot Marie before tracking down and killing the boys, and finally murdered the infant Mary Lou, who was believed to have been beaten to death rather than shot. When the killings were complete, Lawson walked into the nearby woods and, several hours later on December 25th, 1929, ended his own life with a gunshot. The sole survivor of the massacre was his eldest son, Arthur, who had been deliberately sent away on an errand shortly before the violence began. When the family members were discovered, their bodies were found carefully arranged with their arms crossed and rocks placed beneath their heads, suggesting a disturbing sense of deliberation. Lawson's final gunshot was heard by the many people who had already learned of the murders and gathered on the property, and a police officer accompanying Arthur ran toward the sound, discovering Lawson's body near a tree along with letters addressed to his parents. Footprints circling the tree indicated that Lawson had paced back and forth before taking his own life, a final unsettling detail in one of the most haunting family tragedies in American history. In the months leading up to the massacre, several theories emerged regarding Charles Lawson's possible motive, including speculation that a head injury he suffered may have altered his mental state, a belief held by some family members and friends, though an autopsy and later examination of his brain at Johns Hopkins Hospital found no abnormalities. Another far more disturbing theory did not surface publicly until the publication of the book White Christmas, Bloody Christmas in 1990, when claims arose that Lawson had been sexually abusing his daughter Marie, a story that originated from an anonymous source who recalled hearing the rumor during a tour of the Lawson home shortly after the murders. On the eve of the book's release, the author received a call from Stella Lawson, a relative already interviewed, who revealed that she had overheard Fanny Lawson's sisters-in-law and aunts, including Stella's own mother, Jetty Lawson, discussing concerns that Fanny herself had confided in them about a possible incestuous relationship between Charles and Marie. Jetty Lawson had died in early 1928, indicating that Fanny's suspicions had existed well before the murders in late 1929. Further support for this theory appeared in The Meaning of Our Tears, published by the same author in 2006, when Marie's close friend Ella May stated that only weeks before Christmas 1929, Marie had told her she was pregnant by her father and that both Charles and Fanny were aware of it. leading many to believe that Lawson murdered his entire family to prevent the secret from becoming public. Another close friend and neighbor, Hill Hampton, later acknowledged that he knew serious problems were unfolding within the Lawson household, though he refused to provide details, leaving the true motive behind the tragedy forever shrouded in uncertainty. In the aftermath of the murders, Charles Lawson's brother Marion Lawson opened the family home on Brook Cove Road to the public as a grim tourist attraction, and among the items displayed was a cake Marie had baked on Christmas Day, an object that drew such macabre curiosity that visitors began picking raisins from it as souvenirs, forcing the family to later place the cake inside a covered glass server where it remained for many years. The tragedy went on to inspire multiple songs and cultural tributes, most notably the murder ballad The Murder of the Lawson Family, first recorded in 1930 by the Carolina Buddies for Columbia Records and later covered by the Stanley Brothers in March 1956. The case was also revisited decades later in an episode of the PRX podcast Criminal, introducing the story to a new generation. The Lawson family members were laid to rest in a private family graveyard, where the main tombstone bears the square and compass symbol, a detail that long led to the belief that Charles Lawson had been a Freemason, though it was later clarified that he was actually a member of the Junior Order of United American Mechanics, an organization that uses a similar emblem. The final chapter of the family's tragedy came years later when Arthur Lawson, the sole survivor of the massacre, died in a motor accident in 1945, leaving behind a wife and 4 children and closing the last living connection to one of the most haunting family crimes in American history. Case 3, let me explain. On the evening of December 28, 1956, 2 of the 7 children of Joseph Cornelius and Loretta Marcella Grimes, sisters Barbara and Patricia, chose to attend a screening of the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender at a theater in Brighton Park. The sisters, who had always been described as inseparable, were attentive students at the respective schools they attended and shared a deep admiration for Presley, having recently joined his official fan club. This outing marked the 11th time they had seen the film, and they left their McKinley Park home in the early evening, promising their mother they would return before midnight. The Brighton Theater, located a short distance from their home, was familiar territory for the girls, who had previously walked or taken a bus there, carrying a modest amount of money, with Barbara instructed to reserve a small portion in case they decided to see a second showing that evening. What began as a routine, excited outing for devoted fans would soon take a tragic and unforgettable turn, casting a shadow over what had been intended as a joyful evening that a school friend of Patricia's, Dorothy Weinert, later told investigators that she had been seated behind the Grimes sisters during the film, accompanied by her own younger sister. Dorothy and her sister left the theater during intermission of the double feature, around the late evening, and as they exited, Dorothy observed Barbara and Patricia standing in line to purchase popcorn. The sisters appeared cheerful and in good spirits, showing no sign of distress or unusual behavior, giving the impression of a normal evening outing with excitement and anticipation for the remainder of the film. Both Barbara and Patricia stayed to watch the second screening of Love Me Tender, meaning they were expected to return home late in the evening. When the sisters had not arrived by midnight, their mother, Loretta, sent their older sister Teresa and brother Joey to wait at the bus stop nearest the family home, hoping to meet them there. After several buses passed without either girl arriving, the 2 siblings returned home empty-handed. By this point, Loretta had already attempted to contact friends of the girls in case they had gone to another address, but with no success, and upon seeing her older children return without their sisters, she filed missing person reports with the Chicago Police Department in the early hours of December 29, 1956, setting in motion a frantic search for Barbara and Patricia that would soon grip the city. The disappearance of Barbara and Patricia Grimes triggered one of the largest missing person investigations in the history of Cook County, prompting a massive citywide search with hundreds of police officers assigned full-time to the case. Officers from surrounding suburbs joined the effort, and a dedicated task force was formed solely to locate the sisters, with ground searches beginning on December 29, 1956, bolstered by hundreds of local volunteers. Authorities conducted door-to-door canvassing throughout Brighton Park, dredged numerous canals and rivers, and distributed tens of thousands of flyers to local homes, while parishioners of the Sisters' Church offered a substantial reward for information regarding their whereabouts. The investigation ultimately involved questioning hundreds of thousands of individuals, with a smaller number subjected to intensive interrogation regarding potential involvement, though the only arrests and charges brought against those who confessed eventually fell apart. As one man later claimed his confession had been coerced after enduring a prolonged and stressful interrogation. The immense scale of the search reflected both the urgency and the shock that had gripped the community, as residents and law enforcement alike combed the city in hopes of finding the missing sisters. Despite the extensive efforts of the police and widespread media appeals that generated numerous reported sightings of the sisters, investigators uncovered little in the way of concrete evidence. Several teenagers who had been at the Brighton Theater on December 28, 1956, came forward to say that they had seen Barbara and Patricia speaking with, and then entering a car driven by a young man whose appearance resembled that of Elvis Presley. The vehicle was consistently described by multiple eyewitnesses as a Mercury model, providing one of the few tangible leads amid the overwhelming uncertainty and growing concern surrounding the girl's disappearance, before the task force was fully established, and despite objections from the girl's parents. Several investigators initially assigned to the case speculated that Barbara and Patricia had either run away from home or were voluntarily staying with boyfriends. Although the sisters had become front-page news by the end of December, their disappearance was not taken seriously as a full missing persons investigation until approximately a week had passed without any contact from the girls with family or friends. In the meantime, media appeals continued relentlessly, urging the sisters to return home and encouraging anyone who had seen them to contact authorities. As a result, numerous alleged sightings were reported to police well into early January, often placing one or both of the sisters at various business establishments. And these reports seemed to support the initial theory that the girls had left of their own volition, delaying the full-scale investigative response that would eventually unfold. Speculation continued to grow that the sisters might have traveled to Nashville, Tennessee, to see Elvis Presley in concert, or that they had left home of their own accord in an effort to emulate the singer's glamorous lifestyle. In the event that the girls had been abducted, their mother, Loretta Grimes, made a heartfelt public plea, asking anyone holding them to allow the sisters to contact her, and promising that she would forgive them from the bottom of her heart. On January 19, 1957, an official statement was issued from Presley's Graceland estate, broadcast on television, urging the girls to return home and ease their mother's worries. Presley himself also made a direct appeal over the radio, personally imploring Barbara and Patricia to come back to their family, adding a powerful celebrity voice to the already intense public concern and media coverage surrounding the disappearance that on January 22, 1957, following a rapid thaw of recent snowfall, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott noticed what he initially described as flesh-colored objects behind a guardrail while driving along a rural country road called German Church Road, just east of County Line Road in unincorporated Willow Springs. Unsure of what he had seen and briefly considering that the forms might be mannequins, Prescott returned later with his wife, Marie, who fainted when she took a closer look to their horror. The forms were revealed to be the nude, frozen bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Shocked and distraught, the Prescotts immediately reported their discovery to the Willow Springs Police Department, setting off the tragic confirmation of the sisters' fate and transforming the already high-profile missing persons case into a grim homicide investigation that would rivet the nation. The bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes were found lying on a flat, snow-covered section of ground just behind the guardrail, which extended a short distance before the embankment of Devil's Creek. Barbara was positioned on her side with her legs slightly drawn up toward her torso, while Patricia lay on her back with her body partially covering her sister's head and her own head turned sharply to the side. Investigators believe the sisters had most likely been transported to this location by car, with their bodies then dragged or lifted out of the vehicle and placed or thrown behind the guardrail. Examination revealed multiple wounds on Barbara's chest, resembling those inflicted by an ice pick, along with injuries to her face and head consistent with blunt force trauma, while Patricia's body displayed numerous bruises across her face and torso. The sisters' father, Joseph Grimes, was brought to the site to formally identify the bodies, a moment that confirmed the grim outcome of the case and underscored the horror that had enveloped the family and the community. Following Joseph Grimes' confirmation of his daughter's identities, more than 100 police officers from multiple suburban Chicago departments, assisted by numerous local volunteers and the forest preserves, conducted an extensive search of the crime scene. Despite the large-scale effort, the investigation uncovered little to no tangible evidence connected to the murders, and any potential links between items found at the site and the crime were never determined. The search itself later faced criticism, as the involvement of untrained volunteers resulted in the possibility that crucial evidence may have been inadvertently destroyed or trampled, complicating the case and leaving investigators with few leads as they attempted to unravel the circumstances surrounding the sisters' brutal deaths. The day after their discovery, Barbara and Patricia Grimes underwent autopsies conducted by 3 experienced forensic pathologists, each of whom performed a thorough 5-hour examination of the bodies, but were unable to reach a definitive consensus on the precise time or cause of death. By analyzing the sisters' stomach contents, which reflected the approximate proportions of their last known meals and subsequent snacks on the evening of December 28, 1956, the experts estimated that both girls had most likely died within a few hours of the last time they were seen alive at the Brighton Theater, placing their time of death in the late evening of December 28th or the early hours of December 29th. The cause of death in both cases was ultimately determined to be a combination of shock and exposure, although each pathologist arrived at this conclusion through a process of elimination after considering other possibilities. Additionally, the pathologist noted that many of the wounds on the sisters' bodies were most likely inflicted by rodents after death, and that puncture wounds observed on the bodies had occurred post-mortem rather than during the events leading to their deaths, and immediately fatal injuries were found on either Barbara or Patricia, and toxicology reports confirmed that neither girl had been intoxicated, drugged, or poisoned prior to her death. While none of the sisters' clothing was ever recovered, pathologists noted that their bodies were remarkably clean despite the conditions in which they were found. The autopsies also indicated that Barbara had likely engaged in sexual intercourse around the time of her death, though no evidence of forcible molestation was identified. Official death certificates for both sisters listed their cause of death as murder, specifying that the immediate mechanism had been secondary shock resulting from exposure to extreme cold, which had lowered their body temperatures to levels incompatible with life. These findings underscored the chilling circumstances of the sisters' final hours, blending the horror of their deaths with lingering uncertainty about the precise events that had led to their demise. One of the coroners who conducted the autopsies, Walter McCarran, suggested that the sisters' bodies had remained undiscovered behind the guardrail on German Church Road for many days before they were finally found. He noted that the remarkably preserved condition of the bodies, despite the time that had passed since their disappearance, was largely due to the frigid temperatures in the weeks leading up to January 22nd, combined with recent snowfalls and consistently cold weather. McCarran further concluded that the bodies had likely remained hidden for more than 3 weeks, citing a layer of snow that had blanketed the area on January 9th and subsequently melted rapidly in the days immediately preceding their discovery, which had ultimately revealed the tragic scene to the Prescotts and the authorities. Despite the official conclusions drawn from the autopsies, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with the established time of death. He told the media that numerous marks of violence on the sisters' faces were strongly indicative of deliberate harm rather than post-mortem rodent activity, challenging the pathologist's interpretations. Gloss further argued that a thin layer of ice found encrusting their bodies suggested that Barbara and Patricia had likely been alive until at least early January, because only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to interact with their body heat and form the observed ice layer. According to Gloss, This evidence implied that the sisters' bodies had been warm when they were placed beside German Church Road, casting doubt on the theory that they had died immediately after leaving the theater and raising further questions about the timeline and circumstances surrounding their deaths that in addition to his concerns about the timeline of the girls' deaths. Harry Gloss stated that both Barbara and Patricia had likely been subjected to sexual assaults during their period of captivity, noting that the autopsy on Patricia had revealed the presence of semen, while Barbara's stomach contained curdled milk, a substance she was not known to have consumed either at home or at the cinema on the evening of December 28, 1956. Gloss further maintained that an official suspect in the case, Edward Bedwell, had likely been responsible for the sisters' murders, arguing that the wound marks identified during the autopsies had never been adequately investigated or considered. He asserted that these injuries, combined with evidence of sexual activity, indicated the girls had been beaten and assaulted prior to their deaths, in alignment with claims Bedwell reportedly made during his interrogations in January 1957. Gloss also suggested that investigators had deliberately withheld these and other disturbing details, potentially to protect the girls' reputations or to spare their mother's feelings. In the years that followed, similar allegations emerged from others who claimed to have examined the original case files or interviewed residents of McKinley Park, some of whom alleged that the sisters had a habit of spending time outside bars on 36th Street and Archer Avenue, where they would sometimes persuade older men to purchase alcoholic drinks to deliver to them, a narrative that only added to the controversy and speculation surrounding the tragic case. Despite Harry Gloss's insistence that the pathologists had taken the girls off Madison Street and put them into respectability, other investigators involved in the case maintained that there was no evidence the sisters had been disreputable or subjected to extreme violence or sexual assault prior to their deaths. After refusing to retract his statements, Gloss was dismissed by Coroner Walter McCarran in mid-February, a decision Gloss publicly characterized as politically motivated. Nevertheless, he was later deputized by Sheriff Joseph D. Lohman, who shared Gloss's conviction that the sisters had likely been beaten and tortured by a sexual predator who had lured them into his vehicle under an innocent pretense, allowing Gloss to continue working on the case, albeit without pay, as he pursued his own theory regarding the circumstances of Barbara and Patricia Grimes' deaths. Between the last confirmed sighting of Barbara and Patricia Grimes at the Brighton Theater on December 28, 1956, and the eventual discovery of their bodies nearly a month later, numerous unconfirmed sightings of the sisters were reported to the Chicago Police Department, both within the city and its surrounding areas. Several witnesses, including a bus driver, claimed to have seen the girls board a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue, heading east into the city after the screening, allegedly disembarking at Western Avenue, roughly halfway between the theater and their home, though the reason for this stop remained unknown. Another witness, a young man named Roger Menard, who had also attended the film and had been seated behind the sisters, reported that shortly after he left the theater, Barbara and Patricia walked a short distance behind him along Archer Avenue before a late-model green Buick stopped alongside them, causing the girls to hesitate briefly before continuing on. Just past 42nd Street, a black Mercury driven by two teenage boys pulled alongside the sisters, but they merely giggled and continued walking toward their home. In a separate report, two teenage boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro stated that around late evening on December 28th, they had seen the sisters on 35th Street, near Sealy and Damon Avenues, appearing playful and laughing as they ran in and out of doorways, at a point just a couple of blocks from their residence. These scattered sightings, though never conclusively verified, contributed to the confusion and urgency surrounding the investigation into the Grimes sisters' disappearance. A security guard named Jack Franklin later told investigators that on the morning of December 29th, roughly 12 hours after the sisters had left the theater, he had given directions to two girls near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues, whom he later concluded were likely Barbara and Patricia Grimes, recalling the encounter only because the girls had been unusually rude and abrupt. On the same day, a friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported seeing the sisters walking west on Archer Avenue, 2 blocks from Damon Avenue, while a classmate of Patricia's, Catherine Borick, insisted she had seen Patricia pass a restaurant in the early evening, accompanied by two unidentified young girls. Later that night, a cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago claimed to have seen both girls just after midnight. A railroad conductor, Bernard Norton, also reported spotting the sisters aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Glenview, noting that they appeared to be searching for two sailors named Terry and Larry. On December 30th, in the early morning hours, the owner of the D&L restaurant on West Madison Avenue claimed to have seen both girls, with Patricia apparently too ill or intoxicated to walk without staggering, accompanied by the official suspect Edward Bedwell, a location more than 5 miles from the Brighton Theater. Additionally, a clerk at the Claremont Hotel later confirmed that the sisters had checked into the hotel on that date, and on January 1st, 1957, the girls were reportedly seen aboard a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Damon Avenue. These numerous but conflicting sightings painted a confusing and frustrating picture for investigators, making it difficult to pinpoint the sisters' movements in the days following their disappearance. In the week following the sisters' disappearance, a night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street reportedly refused to rent a room to two girls whom he believed to be Barbara and Patricia Grimes, citing their young age. On January 3rd, 3 employees at a Kresge department store in Englewood claimed to have seen both sisters listening to music at the store's record counter, specifically enjoying songs by Elvis Presley, lending further support to theories that the girls were attempting to follow their idol. Adding weight to the idea that Barbara and Patricia may have traveled to Nashville, a woman named Pearl Neville contacted investigators on January 17th, claiming she had met the sisters in a restroom in Nashville on January 9th and accompanied them to a state employment agency to seek work. Neville described them as appearing tired and bedraggled, and a clerk at the agency later confirmed their identities from photographs, noting that the sisters had used the surname Grimes on their applications. In the early hours of January 14th, the parents of a classmate of Patricia's, Sandra Tolstan, received 2 anonymous phone calls. During the second call, Sandra's mother heard a frightened and depressed young female voice asking for Sandra before the line went dead, and she believed the caller had been Patricia Grimes. Further complicating the investigation, in January, Chicago Sun-Times advice columnist and Landers received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to have witnessed the sisters being forced into a car by a young male on the night of their disappearance, providing a partial license plate number. Despite police efforts, the vehicle was never traced, and the letter's author and authenticity remained unknown. These reports and sightings contributed to a confusing trail of leads that investigators struggled to verify while the search for the missing sisters continued. Edward Lee Benny. Bedwell was a 21-year-old semi-literate drifter from Tennessee who had been evicted from his family home in East Garfield Park in November 1956 and had occasionally earned money in the weeks preceding the Grimes sisters' disappearance by working as a part-time dishwasher in a Chicago Skid Row restaurant. Bedwell, a tall young man who allegedly bore a strong resemblance to Elvis Presley, came under suspicion after John and Minnie Duros, the owners of the restaurant where he had worked, reported that in the early morning of December 30th, he had been seen at their establishment in the company of another young man and 2 girls who closely resembled Barbara and Patricia Grimes. This information was conveyed to the police on January 24th, leading to Bedwell's arrest, after which he was subjected to 3 days of intensive interrogation as authorities sought to determine his involvement in the sisters' disappearance and deaths. Initially, Edward Bedwell insisted that John and Minnie Duros, along with a patron named Renee Eccles who had corroborated the Duros' account, were mistaken in identifying the girls he had been seen with on December 30th. However, on January 27, 1957, he was formally charged with the Grimes sisters' murders after signing a 14-page confession claiming that he and a 28-year-old acquaintance, William Cole Willingham, had indeed been in the company of the sisters from December 30th until January 7th, allegedly spending their time drinking at various Skid Row saloons along West Madison Street. In a statement, Bedwell claimed that after several days, and following an incident in which he and Willingham had fed the girls hot dogs, Both girls have been beaten extensively and then thrown into a snow-filled ditch after refusing their sexual advances. Upon hearing the confession, the sisters' mother, Loretta Grimes, was quoted as saying, "It's a lie. My girls wouldn't be on West Madison Street. They didn't even know where it was." Willingham admitted he had been with Bedwell and two girls in the early hours of December 30th, but denied that they were the Grimes sisters and strongly denied any involvement in their deaths. Bedwell later recanted his confession, explaining that he had fabricated it after 4 days in custody under the mistaken belief that confessing would secure his release. At the start of a 3-day habeas corpus hearing on January 31st, Bedwell testified that threats, bribery, and occasional physical violence during his interrogation had forced him to concoct the confession, leaving the actual circumstances of the sisters' deaths unresolved and the case shrouded in ongoing uncertainty. Two teenage cousins, Irene Dean, aged 19, and Carol King, aged 18, later informed investigators that they were likely the girls who had accompanied Edward Bedwell and William Cole Willingham to the restaurant in the early hours of either December 29th or 30th, with Dean stating that her cousin had paired off with Willingham while she had been with Bedwell. Many Duros recalled having seen Irene Dean at the restaurant on other occasions, but never in Bedwell's company. Autopsy reports on Barbara and Patricia Grimes supported Bedwell's recantation, revealing no traces of alcohol or hot dogs in the sisters' blood or digestive systems, nor any evidence that they had been beaten to death. Additional employment records confirmed that Bedwell had been clocked in at Ajax Consolidated Company in Cicero from late afternoon on December 28th until early morning on December 29th, covering the likely period of the sisters' abduction, further contradicting his confession. On February 6, 1957, Bedwell was released on a $20,000 bond, paid by an individual from Champaign, and all charges against him were officially dropped on March 4th due to the numerous inconsistencies in his statements and a lack of supporting physical and circumstantial evidence. Bedwell was also formally classified as a mentally retarded individual. That same year, he faced trial for the 1956 rape of a 13-year-old girl in Oak Hill, Florida, but was acquitted, and he eventually died in November 1972, leaving the true circumstances of the Grimes sisters' murders unresolved. Max Flagg, a 17-year-old, was initially considered a prime suspect in the Grimes sisters' murders, but Illinois laws at the time prevented juveniles from being subjected to polygraph tests. Despite these restrictions, Chicago Police Captain Ralph Patak persuaded Flagg to voluntarily undergo an unofficial polygraph, during which he allegedly confessed to the murders. With no legal way to use this polygraph or confession as evidence against him, authorities were forced to release Flagg without charge. Moreover, police were unable to prosecute him because there was no physical evidence linking him to the abduction or deaths of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Flagg would later be jailed for an unrelated murder of a young woman, leaving his involvement in the Grimes case unresolved and adding another layer of uncertainty to the decades-long mystery. Walter Krantz, a 53-year-old steamfitter and self-proclaimed psychic, called Chicago's Central Police Complaint Switchboard on January 15, 1957, claiming that he knew both Grimes' sisters were dead and that their bodies could be found in an unincorporated area of Lyons Township. Krantz initially refused to provide his name, telling the operator that he had received the revelation in a dream before ending the call, though the operator was able to trace the call to a location near his home. The area described by Krantz was approximately 1 mile from the actual location where Barbara and Patricia Grimes' bodies were discovered a week later. When questioned, Krantz explained that psychic abilities ran in his family and that he had experienced the vision following a night of heavy drinking. Despite being initially considered by police as their number one suspect, and even having handwriting experts suggest he might have written a ransom note sent to the girl's mother before the bodies were found, Krantz denied any involvement in the sisters' abduction or murders, and after multiple interrogations, he was ultimately released, leaving the case's mysteries unresolved. In the weeks between the disappearance of her daughters and the discovery of their bodies, Loretta Grimes was unable to work to support her remaining children and pay the mortgage on her home, prompting friends, neighbors, classmates, and teachers of Barbara and Patricia to organize various fundraising efforts. Additional contributions were collected through the local press and city council, with donations ranging from 50 cents to $500, which allowed the family to settle the mortgage and arrange for the burial of the sisters. A wake was held in the girls' memory on January 25, 1957, followed by a holy mass at St. Maurice Church, and Barbara and Patricia Grimes were laid to rest side by side at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois, on January 28th, with all fees for the services waived by the Walschlager Funeral Home. Classmates of Barbara served as pallbearers, honoring the memory of the two sisters and providing a measure of support to their grieving family during the tragic aftermath of the case. In May 1957, Loretta Grimes received an anonymous phone call from a person claiming to have undressed and killed her daughters, Barbara and Patricia. And although the family had previously received numerous hoax calls following the girls' disappearance, this caller ridiculed police efforts to hold suspects such as Edward Bedwell responsible and concluded the call by revealing knowledge only the perpetrator could have known, that the youngest sister's toes had been crossed at her feet before laughing and hanging up 1 year after the murders. Loretta publicly expressed her conviction that her daughters had been killed by someone they knew, noting that despite the bitterly cold weather on the night of their abduction, Barbara and Patricia would never have entered a car driven by a stranger. Joseph D. Lohman, the Cook County sheriff who had strongly believed the sisters were beaten, tortured, and murdered by a sexual predator who lured them into a vehicle on the night they disappeared, later became dean of the School of Criminology in Berkeley and died of natural causes in 1969, on the 18th anniversary of the disappearance of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Ernest Beato, the sole detective who had been involved with the investigation from the very beginning and remained assigned to the case, told the media that police had no credible suspects, and officially, the murders of the Grimes sisters remain unsolved as an open case. Decades later, in 2013, James Grimes, the sisters' younger brother who had been just 11 at the time of their deaths, expressed cautious hope, stating, "I just assumed it was never going to be solved. But maybe there's hope." That same year, retired West Chicago Police Officer Raymond Johnson began a personal investigation into the case, having first developed interest in 2010 while researching a book on the city's history. Johnson, widely regarded as an expert on the Grimes case, has maintained his conviction that the murders are still solvable with public assistance and has suggested that the perpetrator may have been Charles Leroy Melquist, a 23-year-old self-confessed child killer who had been considered a suspect in the sisters' abduction and murder back in 1957. Charles Leroy Melquist, the 23-year-old self-confessed child killer identified by retired Officer Raymond Johnson as a potential perpetrator in the Grimes sisters' case, had previously been convicted of the September 1958 murder of 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott, a girl he had known prior to her death, whose decapitated body was discovered 2 months after her disappearance, less than 10 miles from where Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been found. Investigators at the time noted similarities in the methods of murder and disposal between Scott's death and that of the Grimes sisters. However, Melquist was never questioned regarding his potential involvement in the Grimes case because his attorney forbade him from being subjected to any questioning. The day after Bonnie Lee Scott's body was discovered in 1958, Loretta Grimes received another anonymous phone call in which the caller claimed responsibility for Scott's murder, stating, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one those cops won't solve, and they're not going to affix blame onto Bedwell or Barry Cook." Loretta Grimes remained convinced until her death that this caller was the same individual who had contacted her in May 1957 regarding the Grimes sisters and revealed the detail about the deformity on one of her daughter's feet, a fact that had never been made public, insisting, "I will never forget that voice." Despite the circumstantial links and similarities, Charles Leroy Melquist was never formally charged in connection with the murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and he ultimately died in 2010. Case for Let Me Explain. Maria Ridolph was born on March 12, 1950, to Michael and Frances Ivy Ridolph in Sycamore, Illinois, as the youngest of 4 children, with 2 sisters and a brother. While many locals lived or worked on farms, Her father, Michael, was employed at one of Sycamore's few factories, and her mother, Frances, was a homemaker. By the time she was abducted, Maria was 7 years old, stood 44 inches tall, weighed 53 pounds, and had brown hair and brown eyes. She was an honor student in 2nd grade and had received awards for perfect Sunday school attendance at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of St. John. According to her mother, Maria was high-strung and nervous, prone to becoming hysterical if she got into any trouble, with Frances noting in a 1957 interview shortly after Maria disappeared that only she could calm her daughter down, and someone would likely have to kill Maria to keep her quiet. She was also described as a screamer and had a fear of the dark. Her best friend was 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund, who lived on the same street as the Riddle family. That on the evening of December 3rd, 1957, Maria begged her parents to let her go outside as snow had begun to fall. And after finishing dinner, she and her best friend Kathy Sigmund went out into the dark near Maria's house to play a game they called Duck the Cars, running back and forth to avoid the headlights of passing vehicles. During their play, they were approached by a man whom Kathy later described to police as a tall young adult in his early 20s with a slender chin, light hair, a gap in his teeth, and wearing a colorful sweater. Introducing himself as Johnny, the man told the girls he was 24 and unmarried, then asked if they liked dolls and piggyback rides. He gave Maria a piggyback ride, after which she ran back to her house to fetch a doll to show him, leaving Kathy to return home briefly to get her mittens. When Kathy came back, Maria and the man had vanished, leaving her alone in the snowy street. After failing to find Maria, Kathy ran to the Ridolf house to tell the family, who initially assumed she was hiding and sent Maria's 11-year-old brother to look for her. When he could not locate her, the Ridolfs called the police, and within an hour, officers and armed civilians began searching the town, but neither Maria nor the man she had been with, Johnny, were found. Presuming that Maria might have been taken across state lines, the FBI arrived in Sycamore within 2 days to assist local and state authorities. Investigators interviewed numerous witnesses who had seen the girls playing alone between 6 and 6:30 p.m., as well as family members who had interacted with Maria and Kathy during the doll and mitten errands and Kathy's reporting of Maria's disappearance. Based on these accounts, it was believed that Johnny approached the girls after 6:30 p.m., and the FBI concluded that Maria was abducted between 6:45 and 7 p.m. Kathy Sigmund, as the sole witness who had seen Johnny, was placed in protective custody out of fear that the kidnapper might return to harm her. Authorities had her view photographs of convicted felons and suspects resembling Johnny. John Tessier, who would be wrongfully convicted more than 50 years later, had lived in the neighborhood and was initially on the list of suspects, but the police did not ask Kathy to identify him after he provided an alibi for the night of the crime. In late December 1957, Kathy was taken to the Dane County Sheriff's Office in Madison, Wisconsin, to view a lineup where she positively identified Thomas Joseph Rivard, described in FBI documents as a 35-year-old man, approximately 5 foot 4 inches tall and 156 pounds, with dark blonde wavy hair. However, Rivard had an alibi, as he was in jail at the time of the kidnapping, leading police to suspect someone else in the lineup was the real culprit, and Rivard had merely been included to complete the lineup. Rivard also did not physically resemble Tessier, who was 6 inches taller and 17 years younger than Rivard. And years later, Kathy stated that she did not remember selecting Rivard from the lineup, that Maria's disappearance quickly captured national attention, drawing the interest of both President Dwight D. Eisenhower and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, while law enforcement continued investigating various suspects in the area, including transients, known sex offenders, and a local man who had given children piggyback rides, but no solid leads emerged. Maria's parents appeared on television and in other media, pleading for their daughter's safe return and asking the public for help. On April 26, 1958, near Woodbine, Illinois, 2 tourists searching for mushrooms in a wooded area along U.S. Route 20 discovered the skeletal remains of a small child beneath a partially fallen tree, wearing only a shirt, undershirt, and socks. The decomposed condition of the body indicated it had been there for several months, An identification confirmed it was Maria Ridolph through dental records, a lock of hair, and the clothing she had worn when she disappeared. Her coat, slacks, shoes, and undergarment were never found. No photographs of the scene were taken because the coroner, James Furlong, did not want images of the child leaked to newspapers. Since the crime had occurred entirely within Illinois, the FBI withdrew from the case, leaving it to state and local authorities. The initial autopsy could not determine a cause of death due to the advanced decomposition. But 50 years later, a forensic anthropologist concluded that Maria had likely been stabbed several times in the throat. John Tessier was born John Cherry on November 27, 1939, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, to British Sergeant Samuel Cherry and his wife, Eileen McCullough Cherry. Samuel Cherry was killed early in World War II, and during the war, Eileen served as one of the first female airplane spotters with the UK's Royal Air Force, where she met Ralph Tessier, serving with the United States 8th Army Air Force at RAF Bovingdon, England. She married Ralph Tessier in November 1944, and after the war, she and her son John, then 7 years old, moved with Ralph to Sycamore, Illinois, where Ralph and Eileen would have 6 more children together. Following his mother's remarriage, John began using the last name Tessier, though he was sometimes still called John Cherry. The Tessier family home was located around the corner from the Ridolph residence, less than 2 blocks away, and Ralph Tessier, a sign painter, painted insignia on Sycamore police car doors and was friendly with the police chief. John Tessier was expelled from school in the 10th grade for pushing a teacher and calling her a name, and at the time of Maria Ridolph's disappearance, he was 18 years old, living at home with his parents and siblings while planning to join the U.S. Air Force. On December 4th, investigators visited the Tessier home as part of their neighborhood search for Maria, and according to his half-sisters Catherine and Jean Tessier, their mother told authorities that John had been home on the night of December 3rd, something they later testified was untrue. Shortly thereafter, before Maria's body was found, the FBI investigated Tessier as a possible suspect. Those sources differ on whether the inquiry was prompted by a tip from a local resident or by his parents seeking to clear their son after realizing he matched the name and general description of Johnny. John Tessier and his parents told FBI investigators that on December 3rd, 1957, he had been in Rockford, Illinois, about 40 miles northwest of Sycamore, to enlist in the Air Force, and that he had spent December 2nd and 3rd in Chicago undergoing the physical examinations required for enlistment. On the morning of December 3rd, he visited the Chicago recruiting station and spent the rest of the day sightseeing before returning to Rockford by train that evening, arriving at 6:45 p.m. Upon arrival, he called his parents to request a ride home to Sycamore, since he had left his car at home. Telephone records later confirmed a collect call placed from the Rockford post office to the Tessier home at 6:57 p.m. by someone giving the name John Tasser, as recorded by the operator. After the call, Tessier met with officers from the Rockford recruiting station to drop off enlistment paperwork. The officers confirmed speaking with him around 7:15 p.m., though one expressed concerns about his credibility and conduct. Tessier was then brought to the police station for a lie detector test, which he passed. Based on his alibi and the successful lie detector result, he was removed from the suspect list, and the FBI closed its report on December 10, 1957, noting that no further investigation was being conducted regarding him. Kathy Sigmund was never shown a photograph of Tessier nor asked to identify him, and he left Sycamore the following day to report for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. John Tessier served in the U.S. military for 13 years, rising to the rank of captain, and after leaving the service, he moved to Seattle, Washington, where he graduated from the King County Law Enforcement Academy in June 1974 and became a police officer in the small town of Lacey near Olympia. He later joined the Milton, Washington Police Department, where he clashed with the chief of police, who attempted to fire him and documented numerous complaints about his work and conduct. In 1982, in Tacoma, Washington, Tessier took in a 15-year-old runaway, Michelle Weinman, along with her friend, both of whom knew him as a Milton police officer. Michelle Weinman later testified that shortly after moving in with Tessier, he fondled her and performed oral sex on her. Tessier was charged with statutory rape, a felony, but after plea negotiations, he pleaded guilty to communication with a minor for immoral purposes, a misdemeanor. He was sentenced to 1 year of formal probation and was terminated from the Milton Police Department on March 10, 1982. But on April 27, 1994, John Tessier legally changed his name to Jack Daniel McCullough, stating that he wanted to honor his late mother, and by 2011, McCullough, then in his early 70s, was living in a retirement community in northwest Seattle, working as a security guard. He was found innocent of Maria Ridolfi's murder after an acquittal trial on April 15, 2016, and in 2017, he was issued a certificate of innocence regarding her murder. In 1997, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Solar closed the 40-year-old Maria Ridolf case, naming William Henry Redmond, a former truck driver and carnival worker from Nebraska who had died in 1992, as the man who had likely abducted and killed her. Redmond had previously been charged in 1988 with the 1951 murder of an 8-year-old girl in Pennsylvania, though that case was dismissed after a police officer refused to reveal the name of a confidential informant. He was also a suspect in a 1951 disappearance of 10-year-old Beverly Potts in Ohio. According to Solar, Redmond had told a fellow inmate that he had committed a crime similar to the Ridolf abduction and murder, and Solar believed that Redmond's appearance and behavior matched the description of Johnny. Solar's report was criticized for its lack of supporting evidence and alleged political motivations. He himself acknowledged that the evidence against William Henry Redmond was purely circumstantial and that, had Redmond been alive, it would have been difficult to secure a conviction in the Ridolf case without a confession. For this reason, Solar described the case as closed but not solved, leaving open the possibility that a more credible suspect might later emerge. When Jack McCullough was subsequently tried for Maria Ridolfi's murder, the trial judge excluded any testimony regarding Redmond, ruling that he was not a credible suspect. The case was reopened in 2008 based on allegations from McCullough's half-sister, Janet Tessier. According to Janet, their mother, Eileen Tessier, on her deathbed in January 1994, had said, "Those two little girls and the one that disappeared, John did it. John did it, and you have to tell someone." Janet interpreted this statement as meaning that her half-brother John Tessier had kidnapped and murdered Maria Ridolf. She had also learned from her older sisters, Catherine Tessier Caulfield and Jean Tessier, that Eileen had lied to investigators about John being home on the night of the crime. Another half-sister, Mary Pat Tessier Hunt, was present when Eileen spoke to Janet, but later testified that she had only heard her mother say, "He did it." Nevertheless, Mary Pat said she understood her mother's statement in the same way as Janet, and noted that their older sisters had suspected John Tessier of the murder for years. At the time, Eileen, a cancer patient, was on morphine and described by her doctor as disoriented. McCullough, who allegedly had once threatened Janet with a gun and sexually molested his half-sister Jean when she was a minor, was estranged from the Tessier family by the time of Eileen's death and was instructed not to attend her funeral. Janet Tessier said that over the next 14 years, she made multiple fruitless attempts to get law enforcement, including the Sycamore Police and the FBI, to investigate her mother's statement. Patrick Solar, who during part of this time served as a lieutenant with the Sycamore Police and had identified William Henry Redmond as the most likely suspect in the Ridolf murder, told CNN that Janet had never spoken to him, but that he would not have suspected John Tessier because he knew the Tessier family. Ralph Tessier had painted the Sycamore police cars, and John Tessier had been cleared by the FBI in 1957. In 2008, Janet emailed an Illinois State Police tip line, which led the State Police Cold Case Unit to undertake a lengthy investigation into McCullough's background and alibi. Janet's sisters, Catherine and Jean, told investigators of their long-held suspicions, with Jean adding that John had molested her as a child, as well as other young girls. Another woman alleged that John Tessier had given her a piggyback ride as a child and refused to put her down until her father intervened. State police investigators reviewed the evidence and developed a new timeline in which Tessier could have kidnapped Maria and still driven to Rockford in time to make a telephone call at 6:57 p.m. and meet with recruiting officers at 7:15 p.m. Under this revised timeline, they concluded that Maria would have had to have been abducted no later than 6:20 p.m. Catherine confirmed that the police search for Maria was underway by 7 p.m., noting that she returned home from a party at that time to find the search already in progress. Hoping to have Kathy Chapman, née Sigmund, review a photographic lineup, police gathered 5 pictures from the 1957 Sycamore High School yearbook, but John Tessier's photo was not included because he had been expelled. Investigators obtained a contemporary photo of him from his former girlfriend, in which Tessier wore an open collar shirt instead of a suit and was pictured against a dark background rather than a light one, and Chapman identified this picture as Tessier. Along with the photo, his former girlfriend provided an unused military-issued train ticket from Rockford to Chicago dated December 1957, which investigators used to challenge Tessier's alibi, suggesting that he had not taken the train on his trip to Chicago, but had driven his car instead, making it possible for him to return to Sycamore that afternoon, abduct Maria, and then drive to Rockford. Police also located a high school friend of Tessier's who recalled seeing his distinctively painted car in Sycamore that afternoon and confirmed that Tessier did not let anyone else drive. In July 2011, the Seattle Police Department, working with the Illinois State Police on the investigation, brought McCullough in for questioning using a professional interrogator because of his law enforcement experience. At first, McCullough spoke calmly and cooperated, but when questioned about Maria Ridolf's murder and his whereabouts on the night of the crime, he became evasive and aggressive. After he refused to answer further questions, he was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolf and extradited to Illinois. That same month, Maria's body was exhumed to search for DNA evidence, but none was found. A forensic anthropologist, however, determined that Maria had been stabbed in the throat at least 3 times with a long, sharp blade, noting nicks in her sternum and neck vertebrae consistent with multiple slashes. While stabbing was considered a likely cause of death, an appellate court later stated that the findings did not rule out other possible causes, such as ligature strangulation, which could not be fully investigated due to decomposition of the soft tissue. News of McCullough's arrest in a 54-year-old murder case drew national attention. DeKalb County State's Attorney Clay Campbell, the lead prosecutor, was initially reluctant to take the case because of its age and the absence of any physical evidence linking McCullough to the crime. But after persuasion from the Ridolf and Tessier families, who believed McCullough was guilty, he formally charged him with the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolf. At the trial in September 2012, the prosecution argued that McCullough had been attracted to Maria and decided to kidnap her, but ended up killing her, presenting new autopsy reports suggesting she had been stabbed to death. Although prosecutors suspected McCullough of molesting Maria, they were unable to prove it and did not raise the issue in court. Numerous witnesses testified for the prosecution, including Maria's family members, neighbors, law enforcement personnel, and Kathy Sigmund Chapman, who served as the star witness and identified McCullough as Johnny, the man who had approached her and Maria 50 years earlier. Another childhood friend of Maria's testified that she had also been offered a piggyback ride by Johnny and identified him as McCullough. 3 inmates who had been jailed with McCullough testified that he had spoken about killing Maria, though their accounts were inconsistent and did not align with the evidence indicating she had been stabbed. One inmate claimed McCullough spoke of strangling her with a wire, and another said he accidentally smothered her to stop her from screaming. The defense argued that prosecutors and police had been pressured by the Ridolf and Tessier families to solve the case and implicate McCullough, despite the lack of physical evidence, motive, or proof that he was in the area when Maria was kidnapped. McCullough did not testify in his own defense on the advice of his attorneys. On September 14, 2012, he was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolf and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He was 73 years old at the time of sentencing. McCullough appealed his convictions, and on February 13, 2015, the Illinois Appellate Court, 2nd District, upheld his murder conviction but vacated his convictions for kidnapping and abduction of an infant, ruling that these charges were outside the 3-year statute of limitations in effect in 1957. This decision did not affect his life sentence. as the sentences for kidnapping and abduction had been ordered to merge into the life sentence for murder. Although the appellate court found that Eileen Tessier's deathbed statement should not have been admitted as evidence, it declined to overturn the murder conviction, noting that Judge Hollock had not relied heavily on the statement in issuing the conviction. In 2015, McCullough, representing himself, filed a petition for post-conviction relief seeking to have his murder conviction overturned. The court initially dismissed the petition as frivolous and without merit, but the public defender who had originally represented McCullough at trial and who had continued investigating the case while staying in contact with him, despite no longer being appointed as his attorney, asked the court to reconsider the dismissal. McCullough then filed a successive motion, which could not be denied without a hearing by the state attorney's office. In response to McCullough's post-conviction motions, DeKalb County State's attorney Richard Schmack, who had succeeded Clay Campbell, conducted an extensive review of the evidence and concluded that McCullough could not have committed the crime and was innocent. Schmack found that key evidence establishing McCullough's whereabouts on the evening of Maria Ridolf's abduction had been excluded at trial, including Illinois Bell phone records showing that McCullough made a collect call to his mother from a payphone in downtown Rockford rather than from Sycamore, as alleged at trial. Considering the timing of the call, the roughly 40-mile distance between Rockford and Sycamore, and icy road conditions, Schmack determined that McCullough could not have been in Sycamore when Maria was abducted. Following a court hearing in March 2016, Judge William P. Brady of the Illinois Circuit Court vacated McCullough's original conviction and sentence on April 15, 2016, and ordered a new trial, releasing him on bond pending the retrial. A week later, Judge Brady dismissed the charges, though the dismissal was without prejudice, leaving open the possibility of future prosecution. Brady postponed ruling on a request from Maria's brother, Charles Ridolf, supported by hundreds of local citizens and the city's mayor, to appoint a special prosecutor to replace Schmack, and on August 5, 2016, he denied the motion, which Charles Ridolf chose not to appeal. Ultimately, McCullough was formally declared innocent of Maria Ridolf's murder by the DeKalb County Circuit Court on April 12, 2017, and on July 21, 2016, Porter, McCullough's son-in-law, filed a lawsuit, case 2016-09536, Cook County, Illinois, against the Illinois State Police and the Sycamore Police Department for failing to comply with a Freedom of Information Act request related to the investigation. The FOIA request was prompted by State's Attorney Richard Schmack's allegations of police misconduct on November 3, 2015. In 1958, the Maria Ridolf Memorial Map, an 8-foot square map of Sycamore made of steel and porcelain, was installed on the front exterior of the Sycamore Municipal Building to commemorate Maria Ridolf. The map was removed in 2002 and replaced with a bronze memorial plaque mounted on a pedestal outside the municipal building. The Ridolf family also created the Maria Ridolf Memorial Fund, initially used to pay for the memorial map and later repurposed as a scholarship, compassion, and summer camp fund for local children in need. A portion of the proceeds from Charles Lockman's 2014 book about the case, Footsteps in the Snow, was donated to this fund to the time of McCullough's 2012 trial and conviction. The case drew national attention and was the subject of several news documentaries, including an episode of 48 Hours and a CNN interactive web feature titled Taken, the coldest case ever solved. Charles Lockman's 2014 true crime book, Footsteps in the Snow, also inspired a Lifetime Movie Network documentary of the same name. These works, published before McCullough's conviction was overturned, treated the case as though it had been successfully solved. In contrast, Northern Illinois author Jeffrey Dean Doty self-published a nonfiction book, Piggyback, 2014, which reviewed evidence and court filings to examine whether McCullough had been wrongfully convicted. During his review of the case, State's Attorney Richard Schmack read Taken, Footsteps in the Snow, and Piggyback, and cited portions of Taken and Footsteps in his 2016 court filing supporting McCullough's innocence. Case 5 Let Me Explain. John Wayne Gacy was born at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942, as the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robison. His father, a World War I veteran who worked as an auto repair machinist, and his mother, a devoted homemaker, raised him in a Catholic household. Gacy was of Polish and Danish descent, and his early life was shaped by the cultural and religious traditions of his family, forming the backdrop of his childhood in mid-20th century Chicago. Gacy was close to his mother and two sisters, finding comfort and affection in their presence. But his relationship with his father was fraught with tension and fear, as his father struggled with alcoholism and was both verbally and physically abusive. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him dumb and stupid, and constantly comparing him unfavorably to his sisters, leaving a lasting mark on his young psyche. One of Gacy's earliest memories was of being beaten at the age of 4 for accidentally misarranging car engine components, a punishment that left him both scared and confused. His mother did her best to shield him from these harsh realities, but despite her protection, he was still labeled a sissy and a mama's boy, with others predicting that he would probably grow up queer, adding layers of shame and isolation to his childhood experience. In 1949, when Gacy was 7, his father whipped him after he and another boy were caught sexually fondling a young girl, an event that added fear and confusion to his already troubled childhood. That same year, a family friend began to molest him on occasion, deepening the sense of vulnerability and secrecy he carried. Terrified of being blamed, Gacy never confided in his father about these incidents, quietly enduring the abuse while trying to navigate the conflicting emotions he felt toward his parents. Despite the constant tension and harsh treatment, he still loved his father, though he carried the heavy, persistent feeling that he was never good enough in his father's eyes, a sentiment that would shadow his sense of self for years to come. As a child, Gacy was overweight and unathletic, and a heart condition forced him to avoid sports, setting him apart from many of his peers. In the 4th grade, he began experiencing blackouts, sometimes severe enough to require hospitalization. And in 1957, he was admitted to the hospital for a burst appendix. Later, Gacy estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he spent nearly a full year in hospitals, which he believed contributed to the decline in his school grades due to frequent absences. His medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed, and his father often accused him of pretending to be ill, even confronting him openly about malingering while he lay in a hospital bed, adding yet another layer of tension and mistrust to his already difficult upbringing. In 1960, at the age of 18, Gacy became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate, an endeavor that drew even more criticism from his father, who derisively called him a patsy. That same year, his father purchased a car for him, but retained the title in his own name until Gacy could pay it off, using the vehicle as another tool of control by confiscating the keys whenever Gacy disobeyed. By April of 1962, after years of this tension, Gacy had secretly obtained an extra set of keys, prompting his father to retaliate by removing the distributor cap and keeping it for 3 days. Just hours after his father finally replaced the part, Gacy left home, driving to Las Vegas, Nevada, with only $136 in his pocket, hoping to live with a cousin and escape the oppressive grip of his father. After arriving in Las Vegas, Gacy found work with the ambulance service before being transferred to Palm Mortuary, where he served as a mortuary attendant for 3 months. During this time, he observed morticians embalming bodies and occasionally acted as a pallbearer, sleeping on a cot behind the embalming room. Gacy later confessed that one evening, while alone, he climbed into the coffin of a teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before being overcome with a sense of shock and horror at his own actions. This disturbing experience ultimately prompted him to return home, leaving behind the grim environment that had exposed him to such macabre temptations. Shortly after returning home, Gacy enrolled at Northwestern Business College despite not having completed high school, determined to pursue a professional path. He graduated in 1963 and accepted a position as a management trainee with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. The following year, the company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a salesman, where he eventually earned a promotion to department manager. In March of that year, Gacy became engaged to Marlyn Myers, a coworker, marking a period in his life that seemed outwardly stable and promising, even as the darker aspects of his personality remained hidden beneath the surface. During his courtship with Marlon Myers, Gacy became actively involved in the local chapter of the JCs, dedicating significant time and effort to community service and fundraising projects, which helped cultivate his public persona of ambition and civic-mindedness. That same period marked his second homosexual experience, which he later described as occurring after a colleague in the JCs plied him with drinks and invited him to spend the evening on his sofa, where the colleague performed oral sex on him while he was intoxicated. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield JCs and was recognized as the third most outstanding JC in Illinois, demonstrating a growing reputation for leadership and social engagement. Even as private aspects of his life remained hidden. In September 1964, Gacy and Marlon Myers were married, and shortly thereafter, Marlon's father purchased 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple relocated to manage the restaurants, moving into the home previously owned by Marlon's parents. The position offered Gacy a lucrative opportunity, with a substantial salary and a share of the restaurant's profits, marking a period of outward success and stability in his personal and professional life, even as the complexities of his private life remained largely hidden from public view. During his time managing the restaurants, Gacy established a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool, though he socialized exclusively with the teenage boys, often giving them alcohol before making sexual advances. When his advances were rejected, he would claim they were jokes or tests of character, masking his predatory behavior under a veneer of normalcy. In February 1966, his wife gave birth to a son, followed by a daughter in March 1967, and Gacy later described this period as perfect, feeling that he had finally earned his father's approval. When his parents visited in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the abuse he had inflicted in the past, shaking Gacy's hand and telling him, "Son, I was wrong about you," offering a moment of reconciliation that further reinforced the image of outward success and familial stability, even as darker impulses simmered beneath the surface. While living in Waterloo, Gacy became actively involved in the local JC's chapter, often dedicating long hours to the organization on top of the 12 to 14-hour days he spent managing the restaurants. At meetings, he frequently provided fried chicken for the group and insisted on being addressed as Colonel, cultivating a persona of charm and authority. Behind this respectable public image, however, Gacy and other members of the Waterloo JCs were involved in drug abuse, pornography, prostitution, and wife swapping, reflecting the darker aspects of his social life. Despite his reputation as ambitious and boastful, Gacy was highly regarded within the organization for his fundraising efforts. And in 1967, he was recognized as the outstanding vice president of the Waterloo JCs, while also serving on the board of directors, further solidifying his standing in the community, even as his private life remained increasingly secretive and morally complex. In August 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees Jr., the son of Donald. Edwin Voorhees, a local politician and fellow JC. Gacy lured Voorhees to his house with the promise of showing him heterosexual stag films regularly played at JC events. Gacy gave Voorhees alcohol, let him watch a pornographic film, and then persuaded him into engaging in sexual acts, telling him that he needed to have sex with a man before having sex with women. Over the following months, Gacy abused several other youths, including one he manipulated into sexual acts involving his wife before coercing him into performing sexual acts on Gacy. He also deceived several teenagers by claiming he was conducting scientific experiments and offered them money to participate. In March 1968, Voorhees told his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. His father reported it to the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him with sexual assault and the attempted assault of another 16-year-old boy. Gacy strongly denied the charges and requested a polygraph test, the results of which indicated deception. He publicly maintained his innocence, claiming the allegations were politically motivated because Voorhees' father had opposed his nomination as president of the Iowa Jaycees. Some of his fellow Jaycees believed him and offered their support. Despite this, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charge in May 1968. On August 30th, Gacy promised one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, $300 to physically assault Voorhees in an attempt to prevent him from testifying in court. Schroeder lured Voorhees to an isolated park, sprayed mace in his eyes, and then attacked him. Voorhees escaped and reported the attack to the police. Schroeder was arrested the next day. Although he initially denied involvement, he soon confessed that he had assaulted Voorhees at Gacy's request. Gacy was subsequently arrested and charged with hiring Schroeder to intimidate and assault Voorhees. In September 1968, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the University of Iowa Psychiatric Hospital. 2 doctors diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, noted he was unlikely to benefit from treatment, and concluded that his behavior was likely to lead to repeated conflict with society. They determined that Gacy was mentally competent to stand trial. That on November 7, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy involving Voorhees, but pleaded not guilty to charges related to other use. He claimed that Voorhees had offered himself and that he had acted out of curiosity, a story that was not believed. Gacy was convicted on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. On the same day, his wife filed for divorce, requesting the family home, sole custody of their 2 children, and alimony. The court ruled in her favor, finalizing the divorce on September 18, 1969. Gacy never saw his first wife or children again. During his imprisonment, Gacy quickly developed a reputation as a model inmate. Within months, he was promoted to head cook and became active in the prison's JC chapter, where he expanded membership dramatically in less than 2 years. He also helped secure higher daily pay for inmates working in the prison mess hall and supervised several projects aimed at improving inmate conditions, including the installation of a miniature golf course. In February 1970, he received a Distinguished Service Award for his work with the inmate JC chapter. In June 1969, Gacy was denied parole. In preparation for a second parole hearing scheduled for May 1970, he completed 16 high school courses and earned his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day of that year, Gacy's father died from cirrhosis. When informed of his death, Gacy reportedly collapsed to the floor in tears. His request for supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral was denied. That on June 18, 1970, Gacy was released on parole after serving only a small portion of his 10-year sentence and was placed under 12 months of probation. The terms required him to observe a nightly curfew and move to Chicago to live with his mother. Upon leaving prison, Gacy told his friend and fellow JC, Clarence Lane, who had remained convinced of his innocence, that he was determined never to return to prison and planned to rebuild his life in Waterloo. Despite this claim, Gacy relocated to Chicago within a day of his release. He arrived by bus on June 19th and soon found employment working as a short-order cook. Then on February 12, 1971, Gacy faced charges after a teenage boy alleged that Gacy had approached him at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal, persuaded him to enter his vehicle, and taken him to his residence, where he attempted to force sexual activity. The case was dismissed after the boy failed to appear in court. Later, on June 22nd, Gacy was arrested again following a complaint from another youth who alleged that Gacy had displayed a sheriff's badge, persuaded him to get into his car, and forced him to perform a sexual act. Gacy was charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct, but these charges were later dropped when the complainant attempted to extort money from him. The Iowa Board of Parole was never informed of either incident. Gacy's parole ended in October 1971, and 1 month later his criminal records in Iowa were sealed. With financial help from his mother, Gacy purchased a ranch-style home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, near Chicago. He lived in this house until his arrest in December 1978 and later claimed that all of his murders took place there. In the neighborhood, Gacy was seen as friendly and cooperative, often lending construction equipment to neighbors and clearing snow from sidewalks without charge. Between 1974 and 1978, he also organized large themed summer parties at his home, some drawing crowds of up to 400 guests, including local residents, business contacts, and political figures. In August 1971, not long after Gacy and his mother settled into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, a woman he had briefly dated during high school. Hoff soon moved into the home along with her two young daughters from a previous marriage. The couple married on July 1st, 1972, and shortly before the wedding, Gacy's mother moved out of the residence. In 1975, Gacy had confided to his wife that he was bisexual. After spending Mother's Day together that year, he told her it would be the last time they were intimate. He soon began spending most evenings away from home, returning in the early hours with explanations that he had been working late or attending business meetings. Carol noticed him bringing teenage boys into the garage during these hours and discovered gay pornography, along with wallets and identification belonging to men, inside the house. When she confronted Gacy about these items, he responded angrily, insisting that it was none of her concern. In October 1975, following a heated argument, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed, though by mutual arrangement, she continued to live in the house until February 1976. Their divorce was finalized on March 2nd, officially citing Gacy's alleged infidelity with women, a claim that was not true. In 1971, Gacy had also started a part-time construction business called PDM Contractors, standing for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. With the permission of his probation officer, he worked on construction projects in the evenings while maintaining his daytime job as a cook. He initially focused on small repair jobs, but eventually expanded into interior design, remodeling, and landscaping. By mid-1973, Gacy left his cooking job to devote himself entirely to his construction business. In 1975, Gacy's construction business, PDM, was growing quickly, and he was putting in up to 16-hour workdays. In March 1977, he took on an additional role as a supervisor for PE Systems, a company that specialized in remodeling drugstores. Balancing responsibilities at both PE Systems and PDM, Gacy often managed up to 4 projects at the same time and frequently traveled to other states for work. By 1978, PDM's annual revenue had surpassed $200,000 through his involvement with a local moose club. Gacy learned about a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members performed at fundraisers, parades, and volunteered to entertain children in hospitals. In late 1975, he joined the club and developed his own clown personas, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, creating his own costumes and makeup. Gacy described Pogo as a cheerful, playful character, while Patches was meant to be more serious. Gacy rarely made money from his clown performances, later explaining that allowed him to regress into childhood. He appeared as both Pogo and Patches at countless local parties, political events, charity functions, and children's hospitals. His ongoing voluntary work as a clown during the years he committed his crimes eventually earned him the notorious nickname, the Killer Clown. Many of PDM's employees were high school students and young men. Gacy frequently propositioned his workers for sexual favors or demanded them in exchange for lending vehicles, offering financial help, or promising promotions. He also boasted about owning firearms, once warning an employee, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you? And how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" In 1973, Gacy traveled to Florida with a teenage employee to inspect a property he had purchased. While there, he raped the employee in their hotel room. After returning to Chicago, the same employee confronted Gacy at his home and attacked him in the front yard. Gacy later told his wife that the incident had occurred because the employee had been dissatisfied with payment for shoddy painting work. In May 1975, Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Annucci. 2 months later, he went to Annucci's home, knowing the youth had an injured foot. The two drank a bottle of wine, then watched a heterosexual stag film before Gacy wrestled Annucci to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. One cuff was loose, and Antonucci freed his arm while Gacy was out of the room. When Gacy came back, Antonucci, a skilled high school wrestler, wrestled with him, managed to get hold of the key, and handcuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. Gacy initially threatened the boy, but soon calmed down and promised to leave if Antonucci released him. Antonucci agreed, and Gacy departed. Remarkably, Antonucci continued working for PDM for the next 9 months, during which Gacy never attempted to assault him again. On July 26, 1976, Gacy picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named David Cram and offered him a job with PDM, which Cram began that very evening. Less than a month later, on August 21st, Cram moved into Gacy's home. The following day, they celebrated Cram's 19th birthday with drinks, during which Gacy appeared in his pogo clown costume. Gacy tricked Cram into putting on handcuffs, cuffing his wrists in front rather than behind him. He swung Cram around by the chain, linking the cuffs, and then threatened to rape him. Cram reacted by kicking Gacy in the face and managing to free himself. About a month later, Gacy appeared at Cram's bedroom door with the intention of assaulting him, telling him, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." Cram fought back, straddling Gacy until he left the room, remarking, "You ain't no fun." Cram moved out on October 5th and left PDM, though he occasionally worked for Gacy over the next 2 years. Shortly after, another PDM employee, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved in. Rossi, who had been working for Gacy since May 23, 1976, lived with him until April 1977. During this time, Rossi sometimes assisted Gacy at business grand openings, with Gacy performing as Pogo and Rossi as Patches the Clown. Gacy became involved in local Democratic Party politics, initially volunteering his employees to clean the party headquarters free of charge. His efforts earned him a place on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee, and he later advanced to the position of precinct captain. In 1975, Gacy was named director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, a role he held until 1978. Through his work on the parade, he had the opportunity to meet First Lady Rosalind Carter and was even photographed wearing an S-pin, a designation indicating special clearance. The event later became a source of embarrassment for the United States Secret Service. Gacy killed at least 33 young men and boys, burying 26 of them in the crawl space of his home. His victims included both acquaintances and strangers whom he lured from places such as Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Bughouse Square, or the streets with promises of work at PDM, alcohol, drugs, or money in exchange for sex. Some were taken by force, while others were deceived into thinking Gacy, who often displayed a sheriff's badge and drove a black Oldsmobile with red spotlights, was a police officer. He typically targeted a single victim at a time, though on several occasions he killed 2 individuals in a single evening, a practice he referred to as having doubles. Inside his home, Gacy's typical method involved gaining a young man's trust, often through alcohol, drugs, or friendly gestures. He would then produce handcuffs under the guise of performing a magic trick, sometimes as part of his clown act. Gacy would handcuff his own wrists behind his back, secretly release himself with a hidden key, and offer to demonstrate the trick to his victim. Once the victim was restrained, Gacy would proceed to sexually assault and torture him, often beginning by straddling or sitting on the victim's chest before forcing sexual acts. Gacy subjected his victims to brutal forms of torture. He burned some with cigars, forced others to mimic a horse while he straddled their backs and pulled on makeshift reins around their necks, and violated several with objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after sodomizing them. He often cuffed victims' ankles to a 2x4, a method he adopted from the Houston mass murders. During the abuse, he frequently taunted his captives and, in some cases, partially drowned them in the bathtub, repeatedly reviving them to prolong their suffering. Gacy usually killed his victims by placing a rope around their necks and gradually tightening it with a hammer handle, a method he called the rope trick, often telling his victims, "This is the last trick." In some cases, victims convulsed for an hour or more before dying, while others asphyxiated from cloth gags shoved deep into their throats. Nearly all of his murders occurred between 3 o'clock and 6 a.m., with the exception of his final 2 victims. After killing them, Gacy typically stored the bodies under his bed for up to a day before burying them in the crawl space, where he occasionally sprinkled lime to speed decomposition. Some victims were even taken to his garage and embalmed before being buried. Gacy's first known murder took place on January 3, 1972. According to his later account, after attending a family party the night before, he drove to Chicago's Civic Center early in the morning to look at an ice sculpture display. He then approached 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy at the Greyhound bus terminal and convinced him to get into his car. McCoy, on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, mentioned that his bus was not due until noon. Gacy offered to show him around Chicago and then drove him to his house, promising that McCoy could spend the night and be returned to the station in time for his bus. Before his identification, McCoy was referred to as the Greyhound busboy. Gacy later claimed that the next morning he woke to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway, holding a kitchen knife. Startled, he leapt from his bed, and McCoy raised his arms in a gesture of surrender, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy then disarmed McCoy, slammed his head against the bedroom wall, and kicked him into the wardrobe. McCoy managed to kick Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over, but Gacy quickly recovered, seized him, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy later claimed that he went to the bathroom to wash the knife, then entered the kitchen and noticed breakfast had been set for two. According to him, McCoy had walked into Gacy's room while absent-mindedly carrying the knife in order to wake him. Gacy then buried McCoy in the crawl space of his house and later covered the grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview years after his arrest, Gacy admitted that immediately after the killing he felt totally drained, yet described experiencing a mind-numbing orgasm as he stabbed McCoy and heard his gasps and gurgling. He remarked, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Gacy later claimed that he killed for the second time around January 1974. The victim was never identified. He was strangled and temporarily placed in Gacy's closet before being buried. Gacy later described how bodily fluids had leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. Following this incident, he began routinely stuffing rags, the victim's underwear, or a sock into the mouths of later victims to prevent similar messes. On July 31st, 1975, 18-year-old John Butkovich, who had been employed by PDM for about 2 years, vanished. His car was later discovered abandoned, with his jacket and wallet inside and the keys still in the ignition. The day before his disappearance, Butkovich and two friends had confronted Gacy about 2 weeks of unpaid wages. According to Gacy, the meeting ended with a compromise. If carpeting Butkovich had purchased with his contractor's account was returned to the store, Gacy would issue the back pay check, crediting it to his own contractor account. Butkovich's father contacted Gacy, who claimed he was willing to help search for his son, but insisted that Butkovich had simply run away. When questioned by police, Gacy maintained that Butkovich and his two friends had come to his home demanding the overdue wages, but that a compromise had been reached and all three had left. Over the next 3 years, Butkovich's parents made more than 100 calls to law enforcement, repeatedly urging them to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted that he saw Butkovich getting out of his car and waved to get his attention. According to him, Butkovich approached, saying, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited him into the car and then back to his house, supposedly to resolve the issue of his unpaid wages. Once inside, Gacy offered him a drink and tricked him into allowing his wrist to be handcuffed behind his back. Gacy later confessed that he sat on the kid's chest for a while before strangling him. Initially, he stored Butkovich's body in the garage with the intention of burying it later in the crawl space. However, when his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, Gacy buried the body under the concrete floor of the garage's tool room extension, in a spot where he had originally planned to dig for a drain tile. 1975 was not only the year Gacy's business grew, but also the time when he began to increase the frequency of his outings in search of young male victims, which he often called cruising. The majority of his murders occurred between 1976 and 1978, a period when he mostly lived alone following his divorce. Although Gacy continued to present himself as friendly and involved in the community, some neighbors noticed changes in his behavior after his 1976 divorce. They observed him spending time with young males, heard his car arriving or leaving in the early hours, and saw lights flickering on and off inside his home late at night. One neighbor later recalled being repeatedly awakened for years by muffled, high-pitched screams, shouting, and crying in the early morning, which she traced to the house next door on West Somerdale Avenue. In 1976, just 1 month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Daryl Sampson, who was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6th. Sampson was buried beneath the dining room floor, with cloth forced into his throat. On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared shortly after returning home from a dental appointment. Only hours later, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton, a close friend of Reffitt, vanished while walking home from his sister's apartment. Both boys were later buried together in Gacy's crawl space, and investigators believe they were killed on the same evening that on June 3rd, 1976, Gacy killed 17-year-old Michael Bonin, who had gone missing while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. He strangled Bonin with a ligature and buried him beneath the spare bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old William Carroll, burying him in a shared grave in the crawl space. Carroll was the first of 4 known victims killed between June 13th and August 6, 1976, 3 of whom were teenagers between 16 and 17 years old, and 1 unidentified adult. On August 5th, 16-year-old James Hawkinson was last known to have called his family, possibly from Gacy's home. He died of suffocation and was buried in the crawl space beneath 17-year-old Rick Johnston, who went missing the following day on August 6. Gacy is also believed to have killed 2 unidentified males between August and October 1976. On October 24th, he abducted and murdered teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino, last seen on Clark Street in Chicago. Just 2 days later, 19-year-old construction worker William Bundy disappeared after telling his family he was going to a party. Bundy also died of suffocation and was buried beneath Gacy's master bedroom. Bundy had apparently been employed by Gacy at the time. Between November and December 1976, Gacy killed 21-year-old Francis Alexander. Alexander's last known contact with his family was a phone call to his mother in November. Because his family assumed he had moved to California soon after, he was not reported missing. Gacy buried him beneath the room he used as his office. In December 1976, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik vanished. His girlfriend was the last person to see him outside her house. Godzik had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks and had told his family that Gacy had him dig trenches for some kind of drain tiles in the crawl space. His car was later found abandoned. Godzik's parents and older sister contacted Gacy about his disappearance, but he insisted that Godzik had wanted to run away from home. He also claimed to have received a message on an answering machine from Godzik shortly after he went missing. But when asked to play for the family, Gacy said he had erased IT in 1977. On January 20th, Gacy lured 19-year-old John SCYC to his home under the pretense of buying his Plymouth Satellite. He later admitted to strangling SCYC in the spare bedroom, claiming that Michael Rossi was asleep in the house the following morning. Gacy eventually sold the car to Rossi for $300.2 months later. On March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestige disappeared after leaving a restaurant in Chicago's near North Side. He was later buried in the crawl space above the body of Francis Alexander. Shortly before his disappearance, Prestige had told others he had secured work with a local contractor. Around the same period, Gacy murdered an additional unidentified youth and buried him in the crawl space during the spring or early summer. On July 5th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Matthew Bowman, who had last been seen by his mother at a suburban train station while on his way to a court appointment in Harwood Heights. The following month, Michael Rossi was arrested for stealing gasoline while driving John SCYC's Plymouth. The gas station attendant recorded the license plate, and police traced the car back to Gacy's house. When questioned, Gacy claimed that SCYC had sold the car to him in February, saying he needed money to leave town. A check of the vehicle identification number confirmed that the car had belonged to SCYC. The police did not investigate further, though they did inform SCYC's mother that her son had sold the vehicle by the end of 1977. Gacy had killed 6 more young men between the ages of 16 and 21. The first of these was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, the son of a Chicago police sergeant, who was last seen alive on September 15th. Gilroy lived just 4 blocks from Gacy's home and was later buried in the crawl space. Interestingly, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on September 12th to oversee a remodeling project and did not return until September 16th. A detail that has been cited to support his later claims that he may have had assistance from accomplices in some of the murders. 10 days after Gilroy's disappearance, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Mowry vanished after leaving his mother's house. Gacy strangled him and buried his body beneath the master bedroom. But on October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson vanished after being seen outside a Chicago bar while searching for contracting work. Gacy killed him and buried his body beneath the guest bedroom. Less than 4 weeks later, 16-year-old Robert Winch was murdered and buried in the crawl space. On November 18th, 20-year-old Tommy Bowling disappeared after leaving another Chicago bar. Then, on December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Talsma went missing after telling his mother he was attending a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. Gacy strangled Talsma with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space near John Mowry. On December 30th, 1978, Gacy abducted 19-year-old college student Robert Donnelly at gunpoint from a bus stop in Chicago. He drove Donnelly to his home, where he raped, tortured, and repeatedly submerged him in the bathtub until he was unconscious, taunting him with remarks like, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" At trial, Donnelly later recalled that he was in such agony that he begged Gacy to kill him, to which Gacy chillingly replied, "I'm getting round to it." After several hours, Gacy drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him, warning that if he went to the police, no one would believe his story. In 1978, after Robert Donnelly reported his assault, police questioned Gacy on January 6th. He admitted to having a slave sex relationship with Donnelly, but claimed that everything had been consensual, adding that he had not paid Donnelly the money he had promised. The authorities believe his account and took no action. The following month, on February 16th, 19-year-old William Kindred disappeared after telling his fiancée, who knew Gacy, that he was heading to a bar. Kindred became the final victim buried in Gacy's crawl space. On March 21st, 1978, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall into his car. He chloroformed Rignall and drove him to his home, where he restrained the man's arms and head in a ceiling-mounted pillory and locked his feet into another device. Gacy then raped and tortured Rignall using instruments such as lit candles and whips, repeatedly rendering him unconscious with chloroform. Afterward, Gacy abandoned Rignall in Chicago's Lincoln Park, leaving him alive but unconscious. Rignall eventually made his way to his girlfriend's apartment, where he reported the assault to the police, though they took no immediate action against Gacy. He was able to recall details of the Oldsmobile, the Kennedy Expressway, and nearby side streets. With the help of 2 friends, Rignall staked out the Cumberland exit of the expressway and in April spotted the Oldsmobile, which they followed to 8213 West Somerdale. Gacy was arrested on July 15th and subsequently faced trial for assault and battery against Rignall. By the middle of 1978, Gacy's crawl space had reached capacity, leaving no room for additional bodies. He later told police that he had briefly considered using his attic for storage, but worried about issues from leakage. Instead, he began disposing of his victims by dumping them off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy admitted to throwing 5 bodies into the river that year, noting that he believed one had landed on a passing barge, though only 4 were ever recovered. The first known victim Gacy disposed of from the bridge was 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke, who was killed in mid-June after leaving his apartment to buy cigarettes. Shortly before he vanished, O'Rourke had mentioned to his roommate that a contractor on the northwest side had offered him a job. On November 4th, Gacy murdered 19-year-old Frank Landingen, who was last seen alive by his father walking along Foster Avenue. His naked body was later discovered near an inlet of the Des Plaines River by two duck hunters on November 12th. Then, on November 24th, 20-year-old James Matsura disappeared after spending Thanksgiving dinner with his family. The day before, he had told his sister that he was working in construction. Matsura was last seen walking toward Bughouse Square, but on the afternoon of December 11th, 1978, Gacy went to Nissen Pharmacy in Des Plaines to talk with the owner, Phil Torf, about a potential remodeling project. While nearby, 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Piest overheard Gacy mention that his company frequently hired teenage boys, offering a starting wage of $5 per hour, nearly twice what Piest was earning at the pharmacy. Shortly after Gacy left the pharmacy, Robert Piest's mother arrived to drive him home so the family could celebrate her birthday. Piest asked her to wait, explaining that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job, and left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Piest was killed shortly after 10 p.m. at Gacy's home. According to Gacy, he offered Piest a soft drink and asked whether there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price, to which Piest replied that he didn't mind working hard. Gacy suggested that good money could be made by hustling, though Piest seemed unconcerned. He then tricked Piest into putting on handcuffs. Gacy's accounts of what followed varied, but in one statement, he claimed Piest did not resist as he removed his trousers and noted that, as he placed a rope around the boy's neck, Piest was crying, scared. Gacy later admitted he took a phone call from a business acquaintance while Piest lay dying. When Robert Piest failed to return home, his family reported him missing to the Des Plaines police. The store owner, Phil Torf, identified Gacy as the contractor Piest had likely intended to meet. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak, whose own son attended Maine West High School alongside Piest, decided to investigate Gacy more closely. A background check revealed that Gacy had an outstanding battery charge in Chicago and had previously served time in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. The next evening, Lieutenant Kozenzak and two Des Plaines police officers went to Gacy's home to question him. Gacy claimed that he had only asked one of the pharmacy youths, whom he assumed was Piest, about remodeling materials store behind the store. He insisted that he had not offered Piest a job and said he had returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. merely to retrieve his appointment book. Gacy told the officers he would come to the station later that evening to give a statement, explaining that he could not do so immediately because his uncle had just died. When asked how soon he could appear at the police station, he snapped, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" At 3:20 a.m., Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been in a car accident. Later that same day, he returned to the station and denied any involvement in Robert Piest's disappearance, again insisting that he had not offered the boy a job. Gacy maintained that his visit to the pharmacy had been prompted by a phone call from Phil Torf, who supposedly told him he had left his appointment book at the store. However, detectives had already confirmed with Torf that no such call had been made. At their request, Gacy provided a written statement outlining his movements on December 11, that believing Gacy might be holding Robert Piest at his home, Des Plaines police secured a search warrant on December 13th. During the search, officers discovered numerous suspicious items, including multiple police badges, a starter pistol, a syringe and hypodermic needle, handcuffs, books on homosexuality and pederasty, pornographic and stag films, capsules of amyl nitrite, a dildo, a 2x4 with holes drilled at each end, bottles of Valium and atropine, several driver's licenses, a blue hooded parka, and underwear too small to fit Gacy. Among the other items were a class ring engraved with the initials JS, a photo receipt from Nissen Pharmacy, and a 36-inch section of nylon rope, all found in a trash as the investigation progressed. Des Plaines police seized Gacy's Oldsmobile along with other PDM work vehicles and placed him under surveillance. Teams of officers, including Mike Albrecht, David Hockmeister, Ronald Robinson, and Robert Schultz, closely monitored his movements. The following day, Michael Rossi contacted investigators, alerting them to the disappearance of Gregory Godzik and revealing that another PDM employee, Charles Hatchela, had been found drowned in an Illinois river earlier that year on December 15th. Des Plaines investigators dug deeper into Gacy's criminal past and learned of Jeffrey Rignall's report that Gacy had lured him into his car, then chloroformed, raped, and tortured him before abandoning him in Lincoln Park. That same day, an interview with Gacy's ex-wife revealed the disappearance of John Butkovich. Investigators also traced the class ring found in Gacy's trash to John Allen's CYC, and a conversation with CYC's mother confirmed several items from her son's apartment were missing, including a Motorola television. By December 16th, Gacy had begun acting friendly toward the surveillance officers, often inviting them to meals at restaurants and occasionally drinks at bars or even at his home. He continued to deny any involvement in Pius' disappearance, claiming the officers were harassing him because of his political connections or his recreational drug use. Confident that they had little grounds to arrest him, he openly taunted the detectives by breaking traffic laws, successfully evading them on several occasions. Later that afternoon, David Cram agreed to an interview in which he disclosed that, due to his poor timekeeping, Gacy had once given him a watch, claiming it had come from a dead person. On December 17th, investigators formally interviewed Michael Rossi, who explained that Gacy had sold him John ZYC's car, claiming he had purchased it because SZYC needed money to move to California. During a further examination of Gacy's Oldsmobile, officers discovered a small cluster of fibers in the trunk, suspected to be human hair. That evening, 3 trained search dogs were brought in to detect whether Robert Pius had been inside any of Gacy's vehicles. One of the dogs lay on the passenger seat of the Oldsmobile, exhibiting what the handler described as a death reaction, suggesting that Pius' body had once been present there. That evening, Gacy invited detectives Albrecht and Hochmeister to join him for a meal at a restaurant. The following morning, December 18th, he took them to another restaurant for breakfast, where he casually discussed his business ventures, his marriages, and his clown performances. During the conversation, he made a chilling remark. You know, clowns can get away with murder. By this point, the constant surveillance was taking its toll. Gacy appeared unshaven, tired, anxious, and was drinking heavily. Later that afternoon, he went to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they end the surveillance. That same day, the photo receipt from Nissen Pharmacy found in Gacy's kitchen was traced to 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a co-worker of Robert Pius. Byers explained that she had borrowed Pius Parka earlier in the evening and placed the receipt in the pocket before returning the coat to him as he left the store. That same evening, Michael Rossi was interviewed again and proved more forthcoming. He revealed that during the summer of 1977, at Gacy's direction, he had spread 10 bags of lime throughout the crawl space of Gacy's home. On December 19th, investigators began assembling the evidence needed for a second search warrant. That same day, Gacy's lawyers formally filed the civil suit against the Des Plaines police, with a hearing scheduled for December 22nd. Later that afternoon, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives into his home once more. While Robinson engaged Gacy in conversation to distract him, Officer Schultz attempted to record the serial number of the Motorola television they suspected belonged to John SZYC. As he flushed Gacy's toilet, Schultz noticed a foul odor emanating from a heating duct, which he suspected could be the stench of decomposing bodies. The earlier search had failed to detect this smell, as the house had been unusually cold at the time. On December 20th, investigators interviewed both Michael Rossi and David Cram. When asked where he suspected Gacy might have hidden Robert Pius' body, Rossi suggested that it could be in the crawl space of Gacy's home. He agreed to undergo a polygraph test, denying any involvement in Pius' disappearance or knowledge of his whereabouts. However, Rossi soon refused to continue questioning, and his erratic and inconsistent answers during the test left Lieutenant Kozenzak unable to determine whether he was being truthful. Rossi did provide additional details about the trench digging he had performed in the crawl space, noting that Gacy had been insistent he not stray from the areas he was directed to dig. Cram corroborated some of this information, recounting Gacy's previous attempts to sexually assault him in 1976. He explained that after returning to Gacy's house following the December 13th search, Gacy had turned pale upon seeing a clod of mud on the carpet and immediately descended into the crawl space to investigate. When asked if he had been in the crawl space, Cram admitted that he had once been instructed to spread lime there and had dug trenches at Gacy's direction, which Gacy claimed were for drainage pipes. Cram described the trenches as approximately 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep. The dimensions of graves that on the evening of December 20th, Gacy arrived at his lawyer's office in Park Ridge for a scheduled meeting, ostensibly to review the progress of his civil suit against the Des Plaines police. He appeared visibly anxious and unkempt, immediately requesting an alcoholic drink. Sam Amarant brought over a bottle of Seagram's whiskey, and Gacy quickly poured himself 2 cupfuls. Sensing something was amiss and growing skeptical of Gacy's insistence on innocence, Amarant prompted him, placing a copy of the Daily Herald on the desk and saying, "You said you had something new to tell me. Something important." Gacy picked up the newspaper, gesturing toward the front page article covering Robert Piest's disappearance, and calmly stated, "This boy is dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Gacy then launched into a sprawling confession that stretched into the early hours of the next morning. He claimed he had acted as judge, jury, and executioner for many, many people, and added that he now wished to play that same role for himself. He admitted to murdering at least 30 victims, most of whom he had interred in his crawl space, while 5 others have been disposed of in the Des Plaines River. He dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, remarking that he sometimes woke to discover dead, strangled kids with their hands cuffed behind their backs. According to Gacy, he buried them in the crawl space because he considered them his property. The alcohol he had consumed eventually caused him to fall asleep midway through the confession. Amarant quickly scheduled a psychiatric evaluation for Gacy that morning. When Gacy awoke several hours later and learned from Amarant that he had confessed to killing roughly 30 people, he merely shook his head and said, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do." Ignoring his lawyer's advice to attend the psychiatric appointment, Gacy left to handle his business matters. Gacy later described his final day of freedom as hazy, acknowledging that he understood his arrest was inevitable and intended to visit friends to say his goodbyes. After leaving his lawyer's office, he stopped at a gas station and handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant. The attendant immediately passed it to surveillance officers, reporting that Gacy had said, "The end is coming for me. These guys are going to kill me." He then drove to the home of his friend and fellow contractor, Ronald Rode. There, Gacy embraced Rode before breaking down in tears, admitting, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." Following that, Gacy visited Cram's home to meet with Cram and Rossi. Surveillance officers observed him holding a rosary to his chin, praying as he drove along the expressway. After speaking with Cram and Rossi, Gacy had Cram drive him to a scheduled legal meeting. During the ride, Cram informed the surveillance officers that Gacy had told both him and Rossi that he had confessed to over 30 murders with his lawyers the previous night. Gacy then directed Cram to drive him to Mary Hill Cemetery, where his father was buried. As Gacy traveled to these locations, police finalized the draft of a second search warrant targeting his crawl space for Piest's body. Noting Gacy's increasingly erratic behavior and concerned he might attempt suicide, the officers decided to arrest him on charges of possession and distribution of cannabis. This ensured Gacy was taken into custody while the second search warrant was formally obtained. At 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, 1978, just one day before the hearing for Gacy's civil suit, the second search warrant was approved. When police informed Gacy that they intended to search his crawl space for Robert Piest's body, he denied that Piest was there, but admitted to killing a young man in self-defense whose remains were buried beneath his garage. With the signed warrant in hand, officers and evidence technicians went to Gacy's home. They discovered that Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, causing the crawl space to flood. Police replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. Evidence technician Daniel Jenny then entered the 28 by 38-foot crawl space, making his way to the southwest corner to begin digging. Within minutes, he uncovered decomposed flesh and a human arm bone. Jenny alerted the investigators, exclaiming, "I think this place is full of kids," suggesting Gacy could be charged with multiple murders. Meanwhile, a police photographer recovered a kneecap in the northeast corner. Digging continued in the southeast corner, revealing 2 lower leg bones. It became clear that the bodies were far too decomposed to be pieced. In the northeast trench, technicians uncovered the skull of a second victim beside the first body, and further excavation around the feet revealed a third skull underneath. Returning to the initial trench, they then discovered the rib cage of a 4th victim, confirming the horrifying scale of the killings. After being told that police had discovered human remains in his crawl space and that he would face murder charges, Gacy said he wanted to clear the air. In the early morning hours of December 22, 1978, in the presence of his lawyers, he gave a formal statement confessing to the murders of approximately 30 young males, all of whom he claimed had entered his house willingly. Some victims were identified by name, but Gacy said he could not remember most of them. He described all as teenage male runaways or male prostitutes, the majority of whom he had buried in his crawl space. Gacy admitted to digging only 5 of the graves himself, claiming that he had his employees, including Gregory Godzik, dig the remaining trenches so he would have graves available. When shown a driver's license belonging to Robert Hasen that had been found on his property, Gacy said he did not know the individual, but admitted the license had been in the possession of one of his victims. He also revealed plans to conceal the bodies further by covering the entire crawl space with concrete in January 1979 that regarding Robert Piest. Gacy confessed to luring him to his house and strangling him on December 11, 1978. He admitted to sleeping alongside Piest's body that evening before disposing of it in the Des Plaines River in the early hours of December 13, 1978. On his way to the police station afterward, he had been involved in a minor traffic accident when his car slid on ice and had to be towed. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23, 1978, to identify the exact location where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert Piest, along with several other victims, into the river. Afterwards, he was taken to his house and instructed to mark the garage floor with orange spray paint, showing where he had buried the individual he claimed to have killed in self-defense. John Butkovich, TOA'd the investigators. Gacy sketched a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where the bodies were buried. Over the following week, authorities unearthed the majority of the bodies from his crawl space, along with a few others in different areas of his property. As walls and flooring were dismantled, investigators also discovered identification cards and additional books related to deviant sexual behavior, further corroborating Gacy's confessions. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, facing charges of 33 counts of murder. The proceedings took place in the Cook County Criminal Court building before Judge Louis Garippo. Because of the extensive media coverage in Cook County, the jury was selected from Rockford to ensure impartiality. In the year leading up to his trial, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, undergoing extensive psychological testing to determine his mental competence to stand trial. During these evaluations, Gacy attempted to convince the experts that he suffered from multiple personality disorder. He claimed to harbor 4 distinct personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a law enforcement persona he called Jack Hanley, or Bad Jack. According to Gacy, his confessions to police were the actions of Jack, who despised homosexuality and considered male prostitutes to be weak, stupid, and degraded scum. Based on this strategy, his lawyers chose to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity. During his opening statement, Gacy's defense attorney, Robert Mata, remarked, "The insanity defense has been looked upon as an escape, a defense of last resort. The defense of insanity is valid, and it is the only defense that we could use here because that is where the truth lies, because if Gacy is normal, then our concept of normality is totally distorted." The defense portrayed Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde figure, producing multiple psychiatric experts who had examined him. 3 of these experts testified that Gacy suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and exhibited multiple personalities that, in contrast, the prosecution argued that Gacy was fully sane and completely in control of his actions. They presented witnesses to highlight his premeditation and the meticulous steps he took to avoid detection. Medical experts called by the prosecution challenged the defense's claims, rejecting the notion that Gacy had multiple personalities or suffered from insanity. Both Cram and Rossi testified about Gacy's instructions to dig drainage trenches and spread bags of lime in the crawl space, noting that he frequently checked the area to ensure that they and other employees did not deviate from the exact spots he had designated. And on February 18th, Robert Stein, the forensic pathologist, testified that the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were markedly decomposed, putrefied, skeletalized remains. Of all the victims he examined, Stein determined that 13 had died from asphyxiation, 6 from ligature strangulation, 1 from multiple stab wounds to the chest, and 10 from causes that could not be definitively determined. When Gacy's defense suggested that all 33 deaths resulted from accidental erotic asphyxiation, Stein dismissed this as highly improbable, emphasizing the implausibility of such a scenario. That on February 21st, Jeffrey Rignall took the stand for the defense. Overcome with emotion, he wept repeatedly as he recounted the torture Gacy had inflicted upon him in March 1978. At one point, during detailed questioning about the abuse, Rignall became physically ill and vomited, after which he was excused from giving further testimony. On February 29th, Donald Voorhees attempted to describe his own ordeal at Gacy's hands and the assaults carried out at Gacy's direction. Overcome with distress, he was unable to continue and stepped down shortly after beginning his testimony. The following week, Robert Donnelly testified about his abuse at Gacy's home in December 1977, visibly shaken as he recounted the events. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garippo requesting a mistrial. In the letter, he argued that he did not approve of his lawyer's decision to enter an insanity plea, that he had been denied the opportunity to take the witness stand, that the defense had not called enough medical experts, and that police testimony regarding statements he allegedly made after his arrest was false and self-serving for the prosecution. Judge Garippo responded by explaining that neither side had been prevented from calling expert witnesses, that Gacy had the legal right to testify if he wished, and that he was free to inform the court of his decision to do so. On March 11th, the trial reached its final stage as both the prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan recounted Gacy's long history of abusing young men, highlighting his careful planning to avoid detection and the chilling testimony of surviving victims, Donald Voorhees and Robert Donnelly, whom he described as living dead from the trauma they endured. Sullivan referred to Gacy as the worst of all murderers and warned the jury of the scale of his crimes, stating, "John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all." After the state's 4-hour closing, defense attorney Sam Amarant took the floor. He criticized the prosecution for scarcely addressing the evidence in their argument and for appealing to the jury's emotions to arouse hatred against Gacy. Amarant sought to portray Gacy as a man driven by compulsions he was unable to control, insisting that the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Gacy was sane. He urged the jury to set aside any prejudice and consider a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that Gacy posed a danger to himself and others, and that understanding his psychology could offer valuable insights for science. The following morning, William Kunkel resumed the prosecution's case. He dismissed the defense's insanity claim as a sham, pointing to the evidence that Gacy had repeatedly demonstrated logical thinking and control over his actions. Kunkel reminded the jury of a doctor who had examined Gacy in 1968 and diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, emphasizing that had the doctor's recommendations been followed, Gacy might never have been freed. Closing his argument, Kunkel dramatically removed photographs of Gacy's 22 identified victims from a display board, imploring the jury not to act out of sympathy, but to show justice. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours before returning a verdict. John Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder, as well as sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both relating to Robert Piest. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders marked the highest number of murder convictions ever handed down to a single individual in United States history. During the sentencing phase, the jury took over 2 hours to decide Gacy's punishment. They sentenced him to death for each of the murders committed after Illinois reinstated the death penalty in June 1977. His execution was scheduled for June 2nd, 1980. That after being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center, where he remained on death row for 14 years, repeatedly asserting, often through contradictory statements, his claimed innocence. During his isolation, Gacy took up painting, sometimes producing works on commission. His subjects were varied, ranging from clowns, including himself as Pogo or Patches, to religious figures like Jesus, the Seven Dwarfs, Skulls, his own home, Elvis Presley, and even John Dillinger. Some of his artwork has been exhibited publicly and sold at auction. Prior to his trial, Gacy began corresponding with journalist Russ Ewing, granting him numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Ewing later partnered with author Tim Cahill to publish Buried Dreams. The details Gacy revealed to Ewing about his first murder were pivotal in helping authorities identify his first victim, that on February 15, 1983, Gacy was attacked by fellow death row inmate Henry Brisbane, known as the I-57 killer, who stabbed him in the arm with a sharpened wire. Gacy was treated in the prison hospital. During his incarceration, Gacy studied law and filed numerous motions and appeals, though none were successful. His legal challenges questioned, among other things, the validity of the initial search warrant obtained by the Des Plaines Police on December 13, 1978, and he objected to the use of an insanity plea at his trial. Gacy claimed that while he had some knowledge of 5 of the murders, those of McCoy, Butkovich, Godzik, CYC, and Piest, the other 28 killings had been committed by employees who had access to his home while he was away on business. In 1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and scheduled his execution by lethal injection for November 14. Gacy appealed this decision, but the U.S. Supreme Court denied his appeal on March 4, 1985. In 1986, he filed a post-conviction petition seeking a new trial, arguing through his then-defense attorney Richard Kling that he had received ineffective legal counsel at his 1980 trial. This petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. Gacy further appealed the 1985 execution order. The Illinois Supreme Court reaffirmed his conviction on September 29, 1988, and set a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally scheduled his execution for May 10, 1994. On the morning of May 9, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in preparation for his execution. That afternoon, prison officials allowed him a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his final meal, Gacy requested a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Later that evening, Gacy received last rites from a Catholic priest before being escorted to the execution chamber at Stateville. As the execution approached, a crowd of more than 1,000 people gathered outside the prison. Most were in favor of the execution, though a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some supporters wore T-shirts referencing Gacy's past appearances as a clown, bearing slogans such as "No Tears for the Clown." At 12:40 a.m. on May 10th, the lethal injection procedure began. However, the execution was temporarily interrupted when the chemicals unexpectedly solidified, clogging the intravenous tube. After the tube was replaced, the execution resumed. The entire process lasted approximately 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists later attributed the complication to the prison staff's lack of experience in conducting executions. The incident reportedly contributed to Illinois later adopting an alternative lethal injection procedure. Commenting on the execution, prosecutor William Kunkel stated, "He got a much easier death than any of his victims." According to published reports, Gacy was diagnosed as a psychopath and did not express remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before the execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of his victims, and that the state itself was committing murder. His final spoken words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass," though prosecutor William Kunkel clarified in 2020 that these words were directed at a prison official and were not part of any formal statement prior to his execution. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed. It is currently in the possession of Helen Morrison, who testified at Gacy's trial and has studied him and other serial killers to identify common traits of violent sociopaths. Gacy was cremated, and the location of his ashes remains undisclosed. In 1984, Sam Amarant developed procedures that were later incorporated by the Illinois General Assembly into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. At the time of the Gacy murders, Illinois law required police to wait 72 hours before beginning a search for a missing child or adolescent. The new act eliminated this waiting period, allowing authorities to act immediately. Other states followed suit, and over time, these measures helped form a national network for locating missing children, eventually evolving into the Child Abduction Emergency System. Widely known today as the Amber Alert of Gacy's victims, only 28 have been conclusively identified. The youngest were Samuel Stapleton and Michael Marino, both 14 years old, while the oldest were Francis Alexander and Russell Nelson, both 21 years old. Cook County Medical Examiner Robert Stein supervised the exhumation of the victims buried on Gacy's property. The crawl space was divided into sections, and each body was assigned an identifying number. The first body recovered, Body 1, was later identified as John Prestige on January 6, 1979, though no cause of death could be determined. Body 2, identified as John Butkovich, was among the first identified on December 29, 1978. On December 23rd, investigators returned to the crawl space to unearth 3 corpses buried in the same trench as Body 1. Body 3, John SCYC, was buried directly above Body 4, Gregory Godzik. Both were identified on December 29, 1978. Body 5 was discovered directly beneath Body 1, buried 36 inches below the surface, indicating he had been the first victim placed in that common grave. The search was temporarily postponed over Christmas, but resumed on December 26th, when 4 more bodies were unearthed. Body 6, Samuel Stapleton, was identified through dental records on November 14, 1979, and Body 7, Randall Reffitt, was identified via X-rays on April 12, 1979. Both were buried in the same grave. Reffitt was discovered in a fetal position with a cloth gag in his mouth, indicating he likely died of asphyxiation. Body 8, Matthew Bowman, identified on January 29, 1979, was found with the tourniquet Gacy had used to strangle him around his neck. Body 9, Timothy McCoy, identified through dental records and a distinctive belt buckle in May 1986, was found beneath a layer of concrete with several stab wounds to the ribs and sternum, suggesting he may have been Gacy's first victim. On December 27, 8 more bodies were discovered in Gacy's crawl space. Body 10, buried beneath the entrance to Gacy's home, remains unidentified and is estimated to have been between 17 and 21 years old and 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 11 inches, 170 to 180 centimeters. Bodies 11 and 12, found beside each other in the center of the crawl space with ligatures around their necks, were later identified on September 11, 1979, as Robert Winch and Tommy Bowling, respectively. Body 13, still unidentified, was recovered beneath the spare bedroom and is estimated to have been 17 to 22 years old and 5 feet 9 inches to 6 feet 2 inches, 180 to 190 centimeters. Bodies 14 and 15 were recovered from a common grave, each with the head and upper torso inside separate plastic bags. They were identified through dental records and radiology images on March 29, 1980, as Michael Marino and Kenneth Parker, too late to be included among the victims identified before Gacy's trial. Body 16, Russell Nelson, identified on January 6, 1979, was found with a cloth rag lodged deep in his throat, causing suffocation. The 17th victim, David Talsma, identified via radiology images on November 16, 1979, was discovered with a ligature around his neck. The following day, more bodies were exhumed. Body 18, Michael Bonin, identified January 6, 1979, was located beneath the spare bedroom with a ligature around his neck. Body 19 was buried directly beneath Gacy's master bedroom. And Body 20, John Mowery, identified through dental records on January 27, 1979, was found in the northwest corner of the crawl space. By December 29, 6 additional bodies were unearthed. Bodies 22, 23, 24, and 26 were buried in a common grave beneath Gacy's kitchen and laundry room, with Body 25, Robert Gilroy, identified January 6, 1979, located beneath Gacy's bathroom. Body 26, still unidentified, was estimated to be 23 to 30 years old and approximately 5 feet 4 inches, 160 centimeters tall. Body 22, identified as William Carroll on March 17, 1979, was found beneath Gacy's kitchen with cloth-like material lodged in his throat and 2 socks recovered from the pelvic region. He was buried directly beneath Body 21, recovered the previous day, who remains unidentified and was estimated to be 15 to 24 years old and around 5 feet 10 inches, 180 centimeters tall. The bones of Bodies 23, identified as Rick Johnston January 1st, 1979, and 24 were commingled, with cloth found inside the mouths of Bodies 24 and 26. Body 25 was recovered beneath Gacy's bathroom with cloth lodged in the throat. As was the final victim from the crawl space, William Kindred, identified May 16, 1979, that operations at Gacy's property were temporarily suspended due to the Chicago blizzard of 1979, but resumed in March despite Gacy insisting that all buried victims had been found. On March 9th, Body 28 was discovered wrapped in several plastic bags beneath the patio in Gacy's backyard. This likely represents his second murder victim, still unidentified, estimated to be 14 to 18 years old and approximately 5 feet 9 inches, 180 centimeters tall. On March 16th, Body 29, Daryl Sampson, identified November 18, 1979, was found beneath the dining room. All victims recovered from Gacy's house were in an advanced state of decomposition. Identification was primarily accomplished through dental records and X-ray charts, with 23 victims identified via dental records and 2 via skeletal trauma, supported by personal artifacts found in the home. Several heads and upper torsos were found in plastic bags, and in some cases foreign objects, including prescription bottles, have been inserted into the pelvic region, indicating sexual assault. Medical examiner Robert Stein concluded that 12 of the victims recovered from Gacy's property had died of asphyxiation. The vacant house was subsequently demolished in April 1979 that a victim found 6 miles, 9.7 kilometers, downstream from the I-55 bridge on June 30th was not initially linked to Gacy. On January 9th, 1979, fingerprint records and a distinctive tattoo identified him as Timothy O'Rourke, with an autopsy unable to rule out strangulation as the cause of death. He was designated victim 31. Investigators later confirmed additional victims connected to Gacy. Frank Landingen, whose cause of death was certified as suffocation from his own underwear being lodged down his throat, was identified via fingerprint records, and a bond slip issued to him the day before his death was found at Gacy's home, assigning him victim 32. On December 28th, a further body was found 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, from the I-55 bridge. 2 days later, he was identified as James Matsura, whom Gacy confessed to murdering shortly after Thanksgiving. He had been strangled with a ligature. Finally, on April 9, 1979, A decomposed body tangled in roots along a Grundy County towpath was discovered and identified via dental records that evening as Robert Piest. An autopsy revealed that paper-like material had been forced down his throat, causing suffocation. 5 of Gacy's victims have never been identified. Using Gacy's confession, the locations of the bodies in the crawl space, and forensic analysis, investigators estimated the likely dates of their deaths. These included Body 28, a male aged 14 to 18, buried in the backyard and likely killed between January 3, 1972 and July 31, 1975. Body 26, a male aged 23 to 30 in the crawl space, likely killed between June 13 and August 6, 1976. Body 13, a male aged 17 to 22 in the crawl space, likely killed between August 6 and October 5, 1976. Body 21, a male aged 15 to 24 in the crawl space, likely killed between August 6 and October 24, 1976. And Body 10, a male aged 17 to 21 in the crawl space, likely killed between March 15 and July 5, 1977. In late 1979, forensic expert Betty Pat Gatliff used the skulls of these unidentified victims to create facial reconstructions that in October 2011, Cook County Sheriff Thomas Dart announced that investigators, having obtained DNA profiles from the unidentified victims, would renew efforts to identify them. Investigators sought DNA samples nationwide from males who went missing between 1970 and 1979. Since then, 3 victims have been positively identified. Numerous other missing youths have been ruled out as Gacy's victims, and 4 unrelated cold cases from 1972 to 1979 have been solved. Updated facial reconstructions of bodies 10 and 13 were released in 2018. William Bundy was identified through DNA testing in November 2011. James Hawkinson, age 16 at his death, was identified in July 2017, and Francis Wayne Alexander was identified via forensic genealogy in October 2021. In 2012, Gacy's DNA, along with that of other executed Illinois inmates, was entered into a national DNA database to investigate potential links to other unsolved murders. At the time of his arrest, Gacy claimed to investigators that he might have killed as many as 45 people, though only 33 victims were ever conclusively linked to him. Investigators excavated his property until they reached the clay substratum beneath the foundations, uncovering 29 bodies. Shortly afterward, Gacy admitted that, following his assault and release of Jeffrey Rignall in March 1978, he began disposing of some victims in the Des Plaines River. He confessed to throwing 5 bodies into the river, though only 4 were recovered and confirmed as his victims. When asked whether there were additional victims, Gacy replied, "That's for you guys to find out." Disputed DNA and dental tests conducted between 2012 and 2016 suggest that one of the bodies recovered from the common grave in Gacy's crawl space, originally identified as Michael Marino in 1980, may not actually have been him. Marino's mother had long questioned the identification, noting that the clothing on the body did not match what her son had been wearing when last seen. DNA testing on the exhumed body of Kenneth Parker confirmed that Parker's remains had not been confused with Marino's. Further, dental x-rays of the body identified as Marino showed all second molars present, whereas a 1976 x-ray of Marino indicated that one had not yet erupted. Complicating matters, the exhumed body lacked both upper and lower jaw bones, raising additional doubts. Despite these inconsistencies, the orthodontist who initially identified Marino's remains has maintained confidence in the original identification that on May 23, 1978, 25-year-old Charles Antonio Hatchela was discovered drowned in the Pecatonica River near Freeport, Illinois, having been reported missing 10 days earlier. Hatchela, an employee of PDM, became linked to the early investigation into Gacy after Michael Rossi informed authorities of both Gregory Godzik's disappearance and Hatchela's death. Rossi noted that Hatchela had previously clashed with Gacy, and that when Hatchela failed to report to work, Gacy told him and several other employees that Hatchela had drowned at the time of Hatchela's death. Gacy's crawl space had reached full capacity, raising the possibility that Hatchela's body had been disposed of in the Pecatonica River. However, Des Plaines authorities, who had contacted Freeport during their investigation into Gacy, were informed on December 27th that Hatchela had fallen from a bridge while attempting to free a stranded vehicle. His death was officially ruled as asphyxia by drowning. Retired Chicago police officer Bill Dorsch stated he had reason to believe there might be additional victims buried on the grounds of an apartment building on West Miami Avenue in Chicago, where Gacy had served as caretaker for several years. In 1975, Dorsch, then a Chicago police officer, observed Gacy holding a shovel in the early morning. When confronted, Gacy explained he was performing work he had been too busy to complete during the day. Dorsch also reported that several residents of West Miami Avenue recalled seeing Gacy digging trenches on the property in the early to mid-1970s. At the time, Gacy was still married to Carol Hoff. In March 2012, Cook County Sheriff's officials requested permission to excavate the property, but the Cook County State's Attorney denied the request, citing a lack of probable cause, including the results of a 1998 search. The Sheriff's Office noted that in 1998, a radar survey had indicated 14 areas of interest, but only 2 had been excavated. 4 of the remaining areas were described as staggeringly suggestive of human skeletons. A second request was granted in January 2013, and a search conducted that spring employed both FBI sniffer dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but no human remains were discovered. One of the first things Gacy told investigators after his arrest was that he had not acted alone in several of the murders, asking whether my associates had been arrested. When pressed on whether these associates had participated directly or indirectly, Gacy replied, directly. He later claimed that Cram and Rossi were involved in several of the killings. Some defense attorneys and investigators researching the case have stated that there is overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. In the 1980s, Gacy informed FBI profiler Robert Ressler that 2 or 3 PDM employees had assisted in several murders. Ressler believed there were unexplained avenues in the case, and that Gacy may have killed more than 33 victims across multiple states, though Gacy neither confirmed nor denied these suspicions. Jeffrey Rignall, who had been assaulted and tortured by Gacy in March 1978, insisted that during his ordeal a young man with brown hair had watched and participated in the abuse. 3 days before his arrest, 2 officers observed Gacy at a bar meeting with 2 employees, Michael Rossi and Ed Hefner. Gacy appeared anxious as he walked with the men out of earshot of the officers before returning closer. During the encounter, Gacy reportedly said to them, "You'd better not let me down, you fuckers. You owe it to me." The officers overheard portions of a hushed conversation in which Rossi asked, "And what?" Buried like the other 5. In interviews from death row, Gacy claimed that at the time of his arrest, 3 PDM employees were considered suspects in the murders, all of whom had keys to his house. In addition to Cram and Rossi, Gacy named his former employee Philip Pace, an acquaintance of Cram and a close associate of John David Norman. In the late 1970s, Norman ran a nationwide sex trafficking operation based in Chicago, known as the Delta Project, with Pace's assistance. At least 2 victims believed to have been murdered by Gacy, Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino, had last been seen alive near Norman's residence, fueling speculation of a possible connection between Gacy and the trafficking ring. Gacy claimed that he was not in Chicago when 16 of the identified victims disappeared. In 2012, 2 Chicago lawyers confirmed that travel records placed him in another state at the time of 3 of the murders, suggesting the possible involvement of 1 or more accomplices. Investigators have also noted inconsistencies in the account of Robert Young, who had accompanied victim Russell Nelson to Chicago. Young filed a missing person report with Chicago police and unsuccessfully sought financial help for Nelson's parents to conduct a search. When Nelson's brothers arrived to search for him, Young offered them employment with PDM. Young was never called to testify at Gacy's trial. Case 5 let me explain Daniel Joseph Blank, born June 28, 1962, is an American serial killer who was convicted and sentenced to death in Louisiana. He is infamously known as the River Parishes serial killer. Daniel Joseph Blank, a mechanic living in Louisiana, carried out 6 murders between late 1996 and mid-1997 in the River Parishes area. Authorities reported that these killings were linked to robberies, which Blank committed to fund his gambling addiction. One of his victims was Victor Rossi. In late October 1996, Blank murdered Rossi, his employer, at Rossi's home in St. Amit. Rossi had recently hired Blank to work at his auto repair shop in Prairieville. During a robbery intended to steal money, Blank took Rossi's life. On the night of March 18, 1997, Blank broke into the home of Barbara Bourgeois in Paulina with the intention of committing a robbery. He had tampered with the telephone wires and was searching the house for money when Bourgeois woke and confronted him. Caught in the act, Blank armed himself with a vacuum cleaner and attacked her, striking her repeatedly. The assault caused severe injuries, including extensive bruising, blunt trauma to the face, fractured nasal bones, a broken sternum, and internal bleeding, which ultimately led to her death. In April 1997, Blank broke into the home of Lillian Philippe, a 71-year-old woman in Gonzales. While searching the house, he came face-to-face with Philippe, who had just exited the bathroom. During the confrontation, Blank assaulted and fatally stabbed her before fleeing with stolen items. Her body was discovered the following day by her sister-in-law. The following month, Blank targeted an elderly couple in Laplace. He invaded the home of Sam Arcury and his wife Luella, robbing them and bludgeoning them to death during the attack. Shortly after, Blank claimed his final known victim, Joan Brock, the wife of a former employer, at her home in Laplace. He robbed her before fatally attacking her in the backyard, ending his series of violent crimes in the River Parishes area. In addition to the 6 murders, Blank attempted to kill an elderly couple, Leonce and Joyce Millett, in July 1997. The couple, both in their 60s, were shot outside their home in Gonzales but survived the attack. Blank was arrested 5 months after the killing of Joan Brock in November 1997 in Onalaska, Texas, where he had opened a mechanic shop a few months earlier. Following his arrest, he gradually admitted to all the murders he had committed. Authorities indicated their intention to pursue the death penalty against him. Initially, Blank faced charges for 3 counts of first-degree murder related to the deaths of Brock and the Arcurys. Shortly afterward, he was indicted on 2 additional counts for the killings of Victor Rossi and Lillian Philippe, raising the total murder charges to 5. By early 1998, he was charged with all 6 murders and 2 counts of attempted murder for the attack on the Millets. Though he pleaded not guilty to all counts, TO ensured that media coverage would not influence the outcome. A court order was issued in April 1998 to keep the evidence confidential. During a court appearance in December of that year, Blank attempted to escape but was quickly apprehended by authorities. In 1999, Daniel Blank went on trial for the murder of Lillian Philippe. The trial began in July in Ascension Parish, with a jury overseeing the proceedings. Although Blank had confessed to the crimes, he maintained his innocence. His attorneys argued that his 12-hour tape confession had been coerced and that he did not fully understand his rights. Investigators, however, insisted that Blank had voluntarily admitted to the murders of Philippe and the 5 other victims. After approximately 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Blank guilty of first-degree murder in September. The following day, they unanimously recommended the death penalty. Later that year, in December, State District Judge John L. Padovan formally sentenced 37-year-old Daniel Blank to death for the killing of Lillian Philippe. Following his sentencing for the murder of Lillian Philippe, Daniel Blank faced a second trial for the killing of Joan Brock in 2000. In April, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, despite his continued claims of innocence. The prosecution again pursued the death penalty. In October of that year, Judge J. Sterling Snowdy of the 40th District formally sentenced Blank to death for Brock's murder. This marked the second time Blank received a death sentence. Judge Snowdy noted that Brock's death had caused profound and lasting harm to her family, the local community, and the state. In 2001, Daniel Blank faced his third murder trial for the killing of Barbara Bourgeois. On the second day of the trial in February, he changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. As a result, Judge Alvin Turner sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later that year, Blank decided to plead guilty to 2 additional counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Sam and Luella Arcuri. In November, he entered guilty pleas for both murders, and Judge J. Sterling Snowdy handed down 2 more life sentences without parole, preventing any further death penalties. Following these trials, Blank was not prosecuted for the 6th murder charge involving the death of Victor Rossi. Daniel Blank pursued several appeals following his convictions and sentences. In November 2001, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal of Louisiana rejected his appeal regarding the murder of Barbara Bourgeois. Blank had claimed innocence and argued that his confession was coerced, but the court dismissed all of his claims. In 2006, his conviction and death sentence for the murder of Joan Brock were vacated due to a clerical error during the original trial. To avoid a new trial, Blank pleaded guilty in July 2009 and was resentenced to a 4th life term without the possibility of parole, while his death sentence for the murder of Lillian Philippe remained in effect. In April 2007, the Louisiana Supreme Court dismissed Blank's appeal against his conviction and death sentence for Philippe's murder. Later, in January 2011, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal also rejected his appeal concerning the Brock murder. In July 2015, Daniel Blank filed another appeal challenging his conviction for the murder of Lillian Philippe, maintaining his claim of innocence. However, in September of that year, State District Judge Jesse LeBlanc rejected the appeal, finding no merit in the arguments, and noting that Blank's detailed confession contained knowledge that only the true killer could have provided. In May 2016, the Louisiana Supreme Court dismissed Blank's second appeal regarding his death sentence and conviction for Philippe's murder. Years later, in October 2021, U.S. District Judge Brian A. Jackson approved Blank's request for new DNA testing of the forensic evidence from the murders. The testing was delayed for 2 years after the defense's expert witness passed away, and due to the state seeking assurances that Blank would not file a lawsuit if exonerated. Blank agreed not to pursue legal action, and in December 2023, Judge Jackson ordered the authorities to proceed with the testing. The procedures were completed in January 2024, and a review of the results is currently underway. Following his death sentence in 1999, Daniel Blank was held on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, while his appeals regarding the murder of Lillian Philippe were ongoing. In January 2016, State District Judge Jesse LeBlanc signed a death warrant, scheduling Blank's execution for March of that year. Despite the announcement, it was widely believed that the execution might not proceed due to a shortage of lethal injection drugs in the state and the potential for additional appeals. Ultimately, in February 2016, the Louisiana Supreme Court issued a stay of execution, delaying any action on the sentence that, in 2023, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards, nearing the end of his term, publicly voiced his opposition to the death penalty and called for its abolition in the state. Despite his stance, the Louisiana legislature voted against a bill that would have ended capital punishment in May of that year. The following month, nearly all of the state's death row inmates, including Daniel Blank, submitted clemency petitions requesting that their sentences be commuted to life imprisonment before the governor left office. These petitions were reviewed by the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Committee on Parole. In July 2023, the board denied all 56 clemency requests, ruling that the inmates had filed too soon after recent judicial rulings, as clemency petitions could only be submitted at least 1 year after a final appeal decision. Later in October, the board also rejected additional clemency requests from 5 other death row inmates, including Antoinette Frank. 2 years later, in February 2025, Louisiana announced plans to resume executions after a 15-year moratorium that had been in place since 2010. The following month, convicted murderer Jesse Hoffman Jr. was executed by nitrogen hypoxia, ending the hiatus. On the eve of Hoffman's execution, Daniel Blank remained one of 56 inmates on death row. After the execution, the number fell to 55 as of 2025. Daniel Joseph Blank continues to be held on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Case 6 Lee Monroe Betterton was born on March 24, 1872, in Kings Prairie Township, Missouri, as one of 15 children in the family of farmers Lee Land and Mary Catherine Betterton, née Whittington. Little is documented about his early years. As an adult, he married Laura Elizabeth McCoy, and together they had several children. The family lived a seemingly ordinary life on their farm in Kings Prairie Township, with Betterton's only known legal troubles being minor convictions for failing to pay fines by 1904. Tensions in Lee Monroe Betterton's life had grown severe, as his marriage to Laura Elizabeth McCoy became increasingly strained with frequent arguments. During one heated confrontation, Betterton violently beat Laura into unconsciousness, prompting neighbors to rush her to a nearby hospital, where she soon died from her injuries, though for reasons unknown. He was never charged in her death. Shortly after, Betterton hired a Choctaw woman named Rose Hudson to work as a housekeeper, and the two developed a romantic relationship, eventually living together in a de facto common-law marriage. Their relationship, however, was unstable, with Hudson leaving him multiple times only to return, and on December 28, 1906, following another argument, she left once more, but later accompanied Betterton to Verona, where his children were staying with their grandfather. After a period there, the pair decided to return home and boarded a train. During the journey, Betterton consumed several pints of whiskey, and upon disembarking at Pier City, they set out on foot toward Monet. Along the way, another argument erupted, and in a drunken rage, Betterton drew a knife and stabbed Hudson 3 times, causing her to collapse. As she lay dying, he poured whiskey over her face until crew members of a passing passenger train intervened and apprehended him. Taken to the city jail, Betterton readily confessed to the killing, claiming his actions were influenced by intoxication. At his subsequent trial in Mount Vernon, he pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Despite his lengthy prison sentence, Lee Monroe Betterton was among several convicted murderers granted parole on September 25, 1917. After his release, he returned to Monet, where he met a local woman named Elzada Lockwood. The couple married in Mount Vernon on June 11, 1918, and settled into a home in the southern part of Monet. To the outside world, their life appeared ordinary in content, with the only notable incident being a house fire on March 26, 1919, caused by accident, which temporarily disrupted their domestic life. However, the apparent happiness between Lee Monroe Betterton and Elzada Lockwood was short-lived, as the couple divorced only a few months later, only to remarry on July 1st in Mount Vernon. Coincidentally, on the same day as Lockwood's daughter Mamie and Betterton's son Ernest also tied the knot. To celebrate, the two couples traveled to visit relatives in Vinita, Oklahoma. With the older couple leaving the younger newlyweds for a few days, they returned to Vinita again on July 9th for another visit. But while other family members were out, Betterton and his wife got into a heated argument. In a fit of rage, he pulled out a revolver and shot Elzada 3 times, causing her to collapse. He then attempted to turn the weapon on his daughter-in-law, but Ernest intervened, wresting the gun from his father's hands. When neighbors arrived after hearing the commotion, Betterton tried to blame his son for the attack, but no one was convinced, and he was quickly taken to the city jail. While awaiting trial for murder, he threatened that he would kill both himself and the rest of his family if ever released. Lee Monroe Betterton's trial for the murder of Elzada Lockwood began on July 29, 1919, with Emery Smith serving as the prosecutor. After nearly 3 months of proceedings, Betterton was found guilty and sentenced to death, with his execution initially scheduled for January 23, 1920. In delivering the sentence, the presiding judge expressed deep disappointment over Betterton's actions, noting the gravity of the crime was made even more tragic by the fact that his own children had testified against him. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Lee Monroe Betterton continued to maintain his innocence while on death row. He was granted a stay of execution for a mental evaluation, which ultimately confirmed that he was sane and fully aware of his actions. His new execution date was set for July 9th, 1920, coinciding exactly with the anniversary of his third wife's murder. On the day of his execution, Betterton addressed the press, once again asserting his innocence while expressing readiness to be reunited with God. At noon, he was executed in the electric chair at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, offering his final words, "Goodbye, and God bless you all." Case 7, let me explain. On October 30th, 1947, Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt were brutally murdered when an intruder broke into their Tacoma home armed with an axe. When Bertha attempted to defend herself, the attacker hacked her to death, and Beverly suffered the same fate after coming downstairs to confront her mother's assailant. Two police officers responding to reports of screams sought a man fleeing through the back door and gave chase, ultimately capturing him and taking him to Tacoma City Jail. The man, identifying himself as 45-year-old Jake Bird, confessed to the killings, claiming they occurred during a failed burglary. Bird had an extensive criminal history, including multiple convictions for burglary and attempted murder, and had spent a total of 31 years incarcerated in Michigan, Iowa, and Utah. A transient by nature, he was born in Louisiana in a location he could not recall and supported himself as a manual laborer and railroad gandy dancer, frequently moving from place to place while laying and maintaining railroad tracks. In late November 1947, Jake Bird was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, with the jury determining that he should receive the death penalty. In early December, he was formally sentenced to death by hanging. After the judge denied a request for a new trial, one of Bird's defense attorneys, J.W. Selden, announced that no further appeals would be pursued, stating that every possible effort had already been made in Bird's defense. Selden went on to publicly express his belief that a man who had reached middle age and posed such a danger to others had no place in society and should be permanently removed. After his conviction and death sentences were announced, Jake Bird was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Speaking for approximately 20 minutes, he expressed frustration that his request to represent himself had been denied and that his own attorneys had worked against him. Bird argued that he had been given no real chance to defend himself, noting that his lawyers had initially apologized for defending him and questioning why they had challenged the prosecution's evidence if they ultimately claimed that his guilt was fully proven. To the conclusion of his 20-minute statement, Jake Bird famously declared, "All you guys who had anything to do with this case are going to die before I do," a warning that would later be referred to as the Jake Bird Hex. In the year following his conviction, 5 individuals connected to the trial died from heart attacks. Judge Edward D. Hodge passed away on January 1st, 1948, at the age of 69. Joseph E. Karpak and Sherman W. Lyons, both involved in obtaining Bird's confessions, died on April 5th and October 28th, 1948, at the age of 46. Court reporter George L. Harrigan died on June 11th, 1948, at 69, and Bird's attorney, J.W. Selden, died on November 26, 1948, at 76. Additionally, 2 months before Bird's execution, Arthur A. Stewart, a guard assigned to death row at the Washington State Penitentiary, died of pneumonia. Jake Bird's execution was originally scheduled for January 16, 1948, at the Washington State Penitentiary. However, he claimed responsibility for 44 additional murders and offered to assist authorities in solving the cases. In response, Governor Monrad C. Walburn granted Bird a 60-day reprieve, allowing him to be interviewed by police from multiple states. Investigators were able to confirm 11 of the murders, and Bird's detailed knowledge of the remaining cases led authorities to consider him a prime suspect in all of them. During his reprieve, interviews with police from multiple states allowed many previously unsolved murder cases to be closed. In addition to the murders in Washington, Bird was linked to killings in Florida, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. His victims were primarily Caucasian women, and he typically used an axe or hatchet to carry out the attacks. While awaiting execution, Byrd filed an appeal for a retrial with the Washington State Supreme Court, which was denied. Subsequent appeals to federal courts, including 3 petitions to the United States Supreme Court, were also rejected. He was ultimately executed by hanging on the morning of July 15, 1949 at 12:20 a.m. in front of 125 witnesses and was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery.